Chapter 707. Yang Chendong saw all of this. This was also the reason why he threw out gold and silver on the street. Although raising an army required food and gold and silver, the more troops there were, the heavier the burden. In the current situation, he didn't have any plans to recruit soldiers, but it didn't stop him from preparing early. This way, if he needed soldiers, there would be an endless supply of backup troops for him to choose from. Originally, although the independent regiment's mission was completed beautifully, they opened the floodgates and unleashed continuous attacks with bows and arrows. In fact, this battle wasn't dangerous at all. But he still wanted to praise them with great fanfare. It was for the sake of buying horse bones with 1,000 gold. Now it seemed that it was effective. On the way back to the largest city lord mansion in the beginning city, he chuckled and said to Zhui Feng, Lu Zhui Yila and the other commanders, "Did you see that? Many of the people below have the intention to join the army. So you can fight the next few battles without worry. Once there are any losses, I will give you the number of new soldiers no matter how many warriors you lose. I will ensure the integrity of your organization. Just give it your all." Yes, sixth young master. Zhui Feng and the others all cupped their fists and said respectfully. The last worry was gone. Even if the army was crippled, it could be quickly replenished. What was there to be afraid of? Next, they just had to give it their all. Compared to the excitement of the mercenaries, the Tatars were furious. Their angry shouts could be heard clearly from tens of feet away from the tent. You lost just like that, how can you still have the face to come back? Why didn't you die in the West River? Do you know that you brought 5,000 cavalrymen? 5,000 cavalrymen. You all died in less than an hour. How can you still have the face to come back? How can you still have the face to come back? Men drag Gulang out and behead him to show our military might. Father, don't be angry, don't be angry. Another slightly younger voice sounded. Please calm down. Horses can stumble. Victory and defeat are common on the battlefield. Besides, it's inauspicious to kill a general in the middle of a battle. Please give General Gulang a chance to redeem himself. Another calm voice sounded. Needless to say, the one who was angry was Agar Dorji. The next to speak were his son Hilario and another tiger general, Su He. After being persuaded by his son and his subordinates, Agar Dorji knew that he couldn't kill them. Otherwise it would only disappoint everyone. Most importantly, the enemy was right in front of them and they needed people. Not only was it inauspicious to kill a general before the battle, he couldn't find a general more capable than Gulang. He thought to himself, although Glenn is responsible for his negligence in this battle, isn't it because the enemy was too arrogant and took the initiative to set a trap? Even if it wasn't Gulang this time, if it was someone else, it was hard to guarantee that they wouldn't fall into the trap. Forcibly gasping for a few breaths, Agadorji looked at Gulang, who was kneeling on the ground, trembling with fear, and said angrily, "Fine, this time Su He and Huro pleaded for you, so I'll spare your life for now. However, you have to redeem yourself. If you make any mistakes, you will be executed without mercy." "Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir." Gulang knocked his head on the ground like he was pounding garlic, and the cold sweat on his head finally disappeared a lot. Gulang was defeated and his 5,000 cavalrymen were all dead. This was equivalent to a wake-up call for Agar Dorji. Facing such a powerful opponent like the mercenaries, he had to put away all his tricks and luck. Next, he had to fight a proper battle and defeat the enemy head-on. Thinking about it, he now had more than twice the number of the enemy. Even if he fought them head-on, there was nothing to fear. Pass down the order, the army will rest for a day. Tomorrow morning we will head to the West River. I want to see what tricks the enemy has that can stop our army from advancing. Agar Dorji finally gave the final word and shook the drums. There wasn't much time left before dawn. When the sun rose, the army set out, and it only took them 4 hours to reach the West River. Compared to last night, the river here had become a lot more turbulent. What was more striking was that on the opposite side of the river, there was a statue made up of about 600 skulls. It seemed to be narrating the tragic battle that had happened here last night. Agar Dorji glared angrily at the human skulls on the other side of the river. He clenched his fists and shouted angrily, "Mercenaries, when we defeat you, we will definitely build an even bigger skulls and let everyone know what the consequences of angering us are. Men, test the river." As soon as the order was given, the soldiers who were good at swimming began to try to cross the river. However, in the face of the turbulent river, after several failed attempts, it was announced that the idea of crossing the West River would not work. At least they shouldn't think about it for the next few days. Sir, the sluice gate of the upstream river has been opened. It is obviously impossible to cross from here. It is better to find another way. Seeing that the army stopped here and faced the statue that was still emitting the smell of blood, the longer they stayed, the lower the morale of the army would be. So he had no choice but to stand up. General Su, do you have any good ideas? Agar Dorji asked calmly. Sir, if we want to get close to the origin city now, there are only 3 ways. First, we can go around the north side and enter from the north slope. Second, we can build a raft and cross the West River by force. Third, we can go around the south side and rush to the south gate of the origin city from the southern forest. Su He, who said the 3 methods in one breath, caused Agar Dorji to nod. This was what a brave general should do. He would not be like his son Huro and General Gulang, who could only look at the river and sigh. Seeing that Agar Dorji nodded in approval of his suggestion, Su He continued, "It is not advisable to cross the river with a raft. Who knows what kind of reaction the mercenaries will have if we build a raft here? If they attack us with arrows halfway, we will inevitably suffer heavy losses. As for the north slope, the terrain there is easy to defend and difficult to attack. It is also not suitable for cavalry to attack. Only the southern forest in the south is suitable for an ambush. However, as long as we are prepared and the area is in a vast location, we can still fight. Of course, how to decide, sir? Please make the decision." After analyzing everything, Su He was able to hold his own. In the end, he still gave the choice to Agar Dorji. Such a capable and sensible subordinate would naturally win the favor of his superiors. At this moment, Agar Dorji's expression became much better after hearing these words. General Su is right. Then according to you, we should go through the southern forest? If this subordinate can think of this, then the mercenaries must have thought of this as well. Therefore, we still need to listen to Sir's final decision. Su He held his fist and said, His words reminded Agar Dorji of something. Yes, all of this analysis seemed to be correct, but how could the mercenaries not know? It was not hard to imagine that the mercenaries would definitely ambush a large number of cavalry in the southern forest to attack him. If that was the case, how should he deal with it? All of a sudden, everyone stopped moving and the surroundings fell into a state of silence. Gulang, who was in the middle of this, blinked his eyes continuously. Then, as if he had thought of something, he whispered, "Sir, this subordinate has something to say, but I don't know if it is appropriate." "Speak." When Agar Dorji was at his wits' end, the general below had a suggestion. Of course, he had to listen to it. It was time for Gulang to perform meritorious deeds. If there was a chance to perform meritorious deeds again, of course he would not hide anything. After getting permission, he said, "Sir, this subordinate thinks like this. After all, the number of mercenaries in the first city is limited. Although they have the geographical advantage, if we can divide our troops and attack from several directions, I think it will inevitably lead them to divide their troops as well. In this way, the strength of their attack on us will be much weaker. Moreover, once we divide our forces, not only will their threat to us be reduced to the minimum, even if something happens and we lose one of our routes, at least the other 2 routes will be safe, and we will still have the possibility of taking down the first city." "Oh? This makes sense." As if suddenly enlightened, Agar Dorji felt his eyes lit up at this moment. Yes, his advantage was that he had more troops, which was the weakness of the other party. If he was willing to divide his troops, it would be equivalent to forcing the other party to divide their troops. In this way, wouldn't the advantage be in his hands? Thinking of this, Agar Dorji seemed to see hope. He first laughed and then said, "Yes, isn't the enemy's troops small? If that's the case, we will immediately divide our troops and force the other party to divide their troops. In this way, the advantage will be in my hands. Well, let's do it this way. If Hala comes out, where's my son? I will give you 5,000 cavalrymen. Immediately build a raft and look for an opportunity to cross the river. Remember, if there is a chance, cross it. If there is no chance, stay here and delay the other party. General Gulang, I will give you 10,000 cavalrymen to go to the north slope. If there is a chance, break through. If there is no chance, find a way to restrain the other party. Once you find that the other party's soldiers guarding the slope have retreated, it will be the time for us to succeed. At that time, you can send troops to attack the north slope and go straight to the north gate of the first city. General Su Gu, you and I will lead 25,000 cavalrymen to the southern forest. With the advantage of our military strength, even if we meet them, They will not have as many soldiers as we do. When the time comes, we will see generals' elegance on the battlefield. Yes, sir. For a moment the 3 generals who were named nodded and agreed. The 3 of them did not raise any objections to this division of labor. Hala's ability was the worst, and he was Agar Dorji's son. Finding a way to cross the river was the safest route. It was the most appropriate place to guard. Gulang's ability was the second best. Guarding the north slope, he could attack and defend. The possibility of accidents would also be much lower. The arrangement could be said to be appropriate. As for Su He, who was the strongest, he was arranged to go with Agar Dorji. He would lead the most troops and be the main force to threaten the first city. It was the most appropriate arrangement. Chapter 708. Finally, the 40,000-strong army was divided into 3 groups and then they left. In an instant, only 5,000 Tatar cavalrymen were left in front of the West River. Everything that happened here was also discovered by the reconnaissance battalion cavalrymen on the other side of the river. They quickly reported it. The enemy divided their forces? Very good. Yang Qindong was not anxious when he heard the news. Instead, he laughed loudly. This was the same as what he and the other officers had imagined. Facing the first city that seemed to be full of loopholes, the enemy seemed to want to attack from multiple angles. This was exactly what Yang Qindong wanted. If the enemy combined their forces, no matter where they chose to attack, they would have to pay a high price to stop them. After all, this was 40,000 cavalrymen. The 3 divisions of the Cold Vanguard Division who were the best at guns were not here. It was impossible to win without paying a price with the Type 81 rifles of the Independent Regiment. However, if the enemy divided their forces, it would be different. This was equivalent to the enemy dividing their powerful fist into several parts. This would give them a chance to defeat them one by one. Dispatch the reconnaissance battalion. Be prepared to kill all the enemy scouts who are responsible for communicating with each other. When the time is up, they are not allowed to communicate with each other. The other battalions will carry out the plan according to the previous plan. Everyone go and make your preparations. Not long after Yang Qindong's voice fell, the meeting room that was full of officers quickly became quiet again. Yang Qindong once again walked in front of the sand table to confirm if there were any loopholes in his military plan. According to the first plan, the deputy commander of the Independent Regiment Xin Honghai led 6 battalions to the West River and set up a formation there. Whenever the enemy tried to cross the river, they would attack across the river and kill the Tatar cavalrymen halfway across the river. Because they were on wooden rafts, there was no space to dodge. Once the arrows came, they could only let the arrows fall on their bodies. After 2 consecutive attempts to cross the river, not only did they not succeed, but they also lost hundreds of cavalrymen. Too despicable. Hilario stood on the riverbank and said angrily as he watched the mercenaries launch their arrows. Although he was angry, there was nothing he could do. After all, the river was nearly 100 meters wide, which was the limit of the bow and arrow. Even if he wanted to use the bow and arrow to suppress it, he couldn't do it. On the other hand, the moment his cavalry crossed the river, it would be equivalent to entering the enemy's firing range. It would be strange if they weren't attacked. Let's wait for a while. I don't believe that they won't run out of arrows. Once the other 2 armies achieve victory, the enemy will have no choice but to retreat back into the city. At that time it will be time for us to cross the river and attack. One of the 1,000-man commanders said to Hilario in an encouraging manner. Looks like that's the only way. Hilario nodded. The mission his father gave him was the safest. If there was an opportunity, they would attack. If there was no opportunity, they would just stay here and exhaust the enemy. As long as they could cause the enemy to leave some troops here, it could be considered a victory. After comforting himself, Hilario gave the order that no one was allowed to attack before the enemy split up their forces. Everyone just had to wait and use this opportunity to conserve their strength. Once they found an opportunity, they would charge across the river and kill the enemy. Reporting to 6th Young Master, the enemy on the other side of the river has indeed become much more obedient. After waiting for one more day, we can consider withdrawing as planned. Vice Commander Xin Honghai said to the soldier beside him with a smile as he watched the performance of Hilario and the others through the binoculars. At the same time, General Gulang had no choice but to give the same order after charging twice. Facing them was a strengthened group of mercenary cavalry, a total of 3,200 people. It was enough to achieve the effect of winning with fewer troops. General Gulang, who led 10,000 troops, couldn't find a chance to win. He had no choice but to place his hopes on the mercenaries to take the initiative to retreat. When the pressure from the front decreased, it would naturally be the time for him to wait for an opportunity to attack. Regardless of whether it was the West River or the North Slope, such a situation had occurred within Yang Qindong's expectations. Due to the topography of these two places, he was not worried at all. Only the southern forest, due to the topography, was the most important battlefield. The performance there would directly affect the overall situation. Beta Persei informed the guards to gather. We will go to the southern forest to take a look. The plan was set. There was no point in staying in the command center. Yang Qindong wanted to personally go to the front line and see what kind of strength the so-called Tatar cavalry had on the battlefield. Southern Forest. The 20,000 Tatar elites led by Agar Dorje were already prepared for the charge of 10,000 cavalry. In order to achieve the purpose of killing the enemy, General Suhi took the order to become the vanguard general. He led 10,000 cavalrymen and was ready to rush here at any time, enter the beginning city and even attack the city. Just opposite the main Tatar cavalry, the Nuzan cavalry regiment with 3,000 people also lined up in a battle formation, ready to fight at any time. Although they had fewer people in terms of numbers, they were not weaker than their opponents in terms of momentum. This was not only because the Nuzan cavalry regiment had won many battles since its establishment and was in an excellent state, but also because they knew that there were no less than 6,000 people lying in ambush in the nearby southern forest. They could support them on the battlefield at any time. In fact, the 10 battalions of the independent regiment had a total of 4,000 people. Among them, there were 2 battalions of musketeers holding Type 81 guns. In addition, the 2,000 people under the 2nd Cavalry Regiment Luzhua were lying in ambush here, ready to support at any time. According to the plan, whether or not they could block the main force of the Tatar army at the southern forest would determine whether or not the first plan could be carried out smoothly. If they could not even block the main force of the enemy, then they could only retreat to the beginning city, and the trap they set for the enemy would no longer be useful. Suhi was riding on a valiant warhorse, wearing a suit of armor to protect the important parts of his body as much as possible. His eyes were bright and full of expression as he stared at the enemy cavalry. He revealed a fierce gaze, and from time to time he would glance at the southern forest, which seemed to have millions of soldiers lying in ambush, proving that he was very worried in his heart. It was completely different from the calmness and confidence he showed. The southern forest was suitable for hiding a large number of ambushing troops, which anyone could see. But the problem was how many enemy troops were lying in ambush here. According to the information sent by the fast horse scout just now, more than 2,000 mercenaries were found in front of the West River, and at least 3,000 enemy cavalry were found on the north slope. So, there should be less than 10,000 mercenaries left, but there were only 3,000 enemy cavalry in front of him. Where did the remaining 6,000 or 7,000 mercenaries go? Would they be lying in ambush in the southern forest, waiting for him to lead the main force to charge up and then suddenly attack from the side? If that was the case, how much confidence did he have in winning? In other words, how much support could Agar Dorje give him at the critical moment? Would he be able to lead the remaining 10,000 Tatar cavalry to help him? Suhi did not have much confidence in this point, not because of anything else, but because he knew Lord Agar Dorje too well. In order to achieve his goals, this person would often use unscrupulous means. In other words, in order to win, he was even willing to risk his son Har Dorje, not to mention that he was only a general under Lord Agar Dorje. He was an existence that could be sacrificed at any time. Because he knew the general too well, Suhi was unable to fight with all his strength. After thinking about it again and again, he decided that he could not send out 10,000 cavalry all at once. Since the enemy only sent out 3,000 cavalry, he could send out 5,000 cavalry to probe the enemy. Men, send out 5,000 cavalry vanguards. We must break through the enemy cavalry's obstruction. After making up his mind, Suhi gave the order as the vanguard commander. The bugle horn sounded and 10,000 horses galloped forward, kicking up clouds of dust as they galloped forward. 5,000 elite Tatar cavalry sounded the horn to charge. They shouted loudly in their own language and charged forward. Looking from afar, it was as if the autumn wind was sweeping away the fallen leaves, sweeping over everything. The enemy has started to charge. Tell the brothers not to be nervous. Let the muskets exhaust them first. The commander of the Nuzan cavalry, Yella, held the reins of his warhorse and said while suppressing the excited neighs of his warhorse. As a result, the 3,000 Nuzan cavalry did not move. They only stared at the incoming enemy, occasionally glancing at Yella. Once the commander gave the order to charge, they would rush out as fast as possible to accomplish their mission. What's going on? Why didn't he send out all 10,000 cavalry? Why did he only send out half of them? What is Zhou Xian doing? At the back of the Tatar cavalry, Agar Dorj said with displeasure when he saw that they only sent out 5,000 cavalry. After saying this, Agar Dorj thought of something. He knew that Zhou Xian did not trust him. It was as if he was afraid that Agar Dorj would not save him if he was surrounded. This made Agar Dorj a little unhappy. He actually dared to disobey his orders. It seemed that after this battle he would have to teach the other party a lesson. Back on the battlefield, the 5,000 Tatar cavalry began their charge. The enemy was only 3 li away from each other. With the neighing of the warhorses, this short distance would take less than a quarter of an hour to reach the enemy. Seeing that the mercenaries didn't move an inch even after she sent out the cavalry, Zhou Xian had a bad feeling about this. Most of the time, intuition on the battlefield was very scary. As soon as Zhou Xi's uneasy feeling came out, it came true. She saw that the originally quiet Nanlin forest suddenly burst with the sound of fire guns, like firecrackers, continuous and endless. Chapter 709. Looking at the charging 5,000 Tatar cavalry, the charging formation was in chaos. Then one after another the cavalry fell off their horses. One after another the strong war horses became ownerless. They stopped in front of their owners and lowered their heads as if saying, "Get up, I'm still waiting for you to lead me into battle." It's the mercenaries' muskets. Seeing this scene, Zhou Xian reacted and his heart sank. Although he already knew this before the battle, Zhou Xian was still shocked when he saw the power of the muskets. He calculated that this wave of attack alone killed about 1,000 cavalry. This greatly reduced the number of cavalry on both sides, making his advantage infinitely smaller. The remaining 4,000 Tatar cavalry finally broke through the blockade of the muskets with the help of the speed of the horses, allowing them to come within a mile of the Nuzan cavalry. "Prepare the bows and arrows. Charge with me." Seeing that the enemy was seriously injured, Yella laughed and then reached out to block the strong bow hanging on his horse. He shouted and urged his horse to charge. The other 3,000 Nuzan cavalry soldiers who couldn't wait for a long time followed suit and took out their bows and arrows. They raised their bows and were ready to shoot at any time. Finally, the battle is about to begin. Zhou Xian opened his eyes wide and stared at the scene in front of him. This was a good opportunity to observe the strength of the mercenaries' cavalry. After escaping from the muskets, he hoped that his Tatar cavalry could play a role in suppressing the mercenaries' cavalry. This was their only chance to turn the tables. Arrows shot from afar, close combat, sabers raised high, cavalry charged. After 1,000 cavalry were killed by the muskets, the Tatar cavalry's morale couldn't help but drop. Many people were terrified because they couldn't see where the enemy was and could die under the muskets of the enemy at any time. This made them think of the scene when they faced the Ming Army's Divine Machine Battalion. Who knew how many ancestors died under those hateful muskets? Now this scene fell on them. They really had a feeling that they couldn't resist. Fortunately, they finally rushed over. Now they were about to engage in a charging battle with the enemy cavalry. This was their strength. They hoped to turn the situation around in this battle. Similarly, the 4,000-strong Tatar cavalrymen started shooting at the Nuzan cavalrymen. From panic to calmness, from being beaten to fighting back with all their strength, the 4,000 Tatar cavalry perfectly displayed the word elite. Both sides began to shoot at a distance of only 1 mile. Both sides' horses were galloping. Under the situation where each person could shoot at most 2 arrows, it was difficult to say who would win. As the arrows continued to fly about, the cavalrymen fell from their horses one after another. The war horses stopped charging and became ownerless. In just 2 waves of archery, both the Nuzan cavalry and the Tatar cavalry paid the price of hundreds of cavalry deaths. In the end, they switched to using bows and arrows to fight in close combat. Kill. The deputy commander of the Nuzan Cavalry Division, Lu Dai, took the lead and led her men into the formation of the Tatar cavalry like an arrow. As the commander, Yella led most of the cavalry to engage in guerrilla warfare. This was a tactic that had been discussed before. A cavalry couldn't be without a commander. Otherwise, the army would be like a sheet of loose sand. Without a commander, they would be defeated one by one. Deputy Commander Lu Dai killed his way in. Along with him were 1,000 Nuzan cavalry soldiers. They followed behind the deputy commander and waved their sharp sabers at the Tatar cavalry around them. In history, the Mongol cavalry was once the subordinate of the Nuzan cavalry. In the end, with their help, the Nuzan defeated the Ming dynasty and established the Qing dynasty. But that was something that would happen more than 100 years later. In this era, the Mongol cavalry was still the strongest cavalry in the world. The Nuzan cavalry was still nothing in their eyes. Reality also proved that the Tatar cavalry was indeed the elite of the Mongolian cavalry. Be it their fighting spirit or their skillful operation and performance, they were slightly stronger than the Nuzan cavalry. If it were not for the fact that the Nuzan cavalry's sabers were sharper and tougher, and if they did not learn the 3-to-3 strategy from Lung Feng, where every 3 horses could form a small fighting group and fight with the enemy, the Nuzan cavalry would not be able to win against the Tatar cavalry. Use the advantage of the saber to increase the speed of your chopping. Commander Yella, who was roaming around the periphery, saw that both sides were actually evenly matched. Because they had fewer people than the enemy's 1,000 cavalry, their losses were even greater. Finally, he couldn't sit still anymore and began to shout loudly to remind his subordinates. If they wanted to use the advantage of the saber, they needed to cut the enemy's saber in half and obtain the advantage of the weapon. With Yella's shout, the Nuzan cavalrymen seemed to have woken up from a dream. They increased the speed at which they swung their sabers, forcing their opponents to fight back. After several collisions, the results finally appeared. Many of the Tatar cavalrymen had cracks on their sabers and some of them even broke in half. The saber suddenly breaking in half was undoubtedly fatal for the cavalry who were in the middle of a fight. When the same saber was chopped over, the enemy's saber had already stabbed into his heart. However, your saber did not even touch the enemy's clothes. What kind of result would that be? The advantage of the saber was brought into play. More and more Tatar cavalrymen were caught off guard. More and more Tatar cavalrymen were chopped off their horses. The situation on both sides was reversing. Charge! Right at this moment, another group of cavalrymen dressed entirely in black iron, and even their war horses were covered in black iron armor, suddenly charged out from the side. Although they didn't have many people, their momentum was astonishing. Their black clothes and black faces emitted a cold and powerful aura. Their bodies were impervious to swords and spears. When this group of 100 people entered the battlefield, they became the mouth of a giant beast that devoured people's lives. They killed the Tartar cavalry and no one could stop them. Is that the enemy, the black cavalry that young master spoke of? Suhi also quickly discovered the existence of the black cavalry. When he saw the other party's heroic performance and killing as if there was no one around, he couldn't help but gasp. He saw with his own eyes that at least a few sabers had hacked at the enemy's black armor. However, apart from producing some weak sparks, they were unable to cause any damage. On the contrary, the Tatar cavalry that attacked were continuously killed by the Heike cavalry. In just a short while, the Heike cavalry had killed over 100 elite Tatar cavalry. The appearance of the black cavalry seemed to have blown the horn of the enemy's counterattack. Several thousand cavalrymen rushed out of the southern forest. They were the troops of Lu Zhua of the 2nd Reinforced Cavalry Regiment. 2,000 men of this regiment were thrown into the battlefield. They appeared like a gust of wind sweeping away fallen leaves. It was as if a steel knife had stabbed into the side of the Tartar cavalrymen and caught them unprepared. Charge, charge with me! Seeing the mercenaries that were lying in ambush in the southern forest charging out, Suhi knew that there was no need to wait any longer. With a loud shout, he urged his horse to charge out. Suhi's horsemanship was indeed very good. His entire body was bent over the side of the horse's back. This way, not only could he reduce the resistance of the horse's advance, but more importantly, he could avoid the bullets to the greatest extent. In the southern forest, Tiger's Mane and 10 battalions of independent soldiers were already prepared to open fire. But facing the superb horsemanship of the Tatar cavalry, they had a feeling that they did not know where to start. Seeing that the Tatar cavalry had already broken through the blockade in front of them, many of the soldiers could not help but shout, "Commander, let's shoot the horses." No, young master said that we should try our best not to harm the horses. Tiger's Mane shook his head affirmatively. Then he pulled out his saber and said decisively, "Everyone listen to my order. Leave 2 musket battalions to suppress the main force of the Tatar army. The rest of you get on your horses and charge with me." Yes. After receiving the order, the 3,000 soldiers of the independent regiment let out a roar in unison. They shouted and got on their horses, pulled out their sabers and charged towards the battlefield from the southern forest. Bullets whistled past his ears, scaring Zhou Xian so much that he broke out in a cold sweat. But when he turned around and saw that the majority of the cavalry was not affected by the muskets, he could not help but let out a long sigh of relief. It seemed that the enemy's muskets were not omnipotent. As long as they dodged well, they could still be safe. This result also increased Zhou Xian's confidence in winning. Leading the 5,000 elite Tatar cavalry, their momentum became stronger and their charging speed also became faster. On the main battlefield, because Yang Qindong led 100 shadow cavalry to join in at the right time, the Tatar cavalry had been separated and they began to encircle and annihilate them. Zhou Xian had no choice but to join in the battle. However, even with the addition of 2,000 cavalrymen from the 2nd Regiment and 3,000 cavalrymen from the Independent Regiment, they were still unable to turn the situation around. On the contrary, the addition of 5,000 cavalrymen was like adding fuel to the fire. They were still tightly suppressed. Zhou Xian watched as the main force of the mercenaries pressed forward with his appearance. His heart was faintly excited. He said to a bannerman beside him, "Quick, inform His Excellency. Ask him to immediately dispatch his troops and attack the main force of the mercenaries together with our army." After the bannerman complied, he used a special method to inform the 10,000 Tatar soldiers of Zhou Xian's order. However, the scene that Zhou Xian was looking forward to did not happen. On the contrary, the scene that he was worried about happened. Agador began to hesitate at this moment. He wanted to protect himself and did not rush forward with his main force. Chapter 7:10. My lord, General Zhou Xian has made another request. A Chiliarch appeared beside Agar Dorji and reported anxiously. "I know, but have you noticed that there are still figures moving in the southern forest? If I'm not wrong, those are the flintlock soldiers left behind by the mercenaries. They are waiting for us to appear," Agadorji said calmly. At the same time he pointed to the depths of the southern forest, as if he had already seen through everything. Without knowing the details of the mercenaries, Agar Dorji would never put himself in danger. This was his cautiousness, but it was also a sign of cowardice and lack of confidence. Of course, even if he did not take the risk, it did not mean that he would not force others to take the risk. After he shifted his gaze away from the southern forest, he said to the Chiliarch beside him, "Inform Gulang and Haruo that we are currently fighting with the mercenary army's main force here in the southern forest and have achieved certain results. It won't be long before there will be signs of a lack of troops. Ask them to seize the opportunity to counterattack. Whoever can reach the beginning city first will be rewarded with 10,000 taels of silver." Yes, Agar Dorji didn't want to take the risk himself, but he placed his hopes on his subordinates. Just as General Zhou Xian thought, even his son was included in the plan. The messenger left after receiving the order. And just after the messenger passed the order, they didn't know that the mercenaries had begun to take action. They cut off the communication between the 3 parties at the right time, making it impossible for follow-up information to flow smoothly. This made this order the last one issued by Agar Dorji. The battle was still going on ahead. Zhou Xian led the last 5,000 cavalrymen into the battlefield, but he still couldn't gain an overwhelming advantage. Instead, as the battle dragged on, the sharp and tough sabers in the hands of the mercenaries played an absolute role. More and more Tatar cavalrymen's sabers were broken, and their combat strength rapidly declined. The addition of the Independent Regiment and the 2nd Cavalry Regiment greatly relieved the pressure of the Nuzan Cavalry Regiment. In addition, the Black Cavalry led by Yang Qindong was invincible. The 100 of them forcibly fought with the momentum of a magnificent army. The death rate of the Tatar cavalrymen began to rise. Retreat. After chopping down one of the mercenary cavalrymen, Zhou Xian was a little out of breath as he watched more and more of his companions fall off their horses and die. With no reinforcements appearing behind him, he knew that if this continued, all of his cavalrymen would die here. He believed that this was an opportunity. He also believed that the mercenaries did not have many soldiers left. Unfortunately, his abilities were limited and the number of soldiers he could command was also limited. At this moment he could no longer see any hope of victory and could only choose to retreat. Pass down my order. All troops retreat. With reluctance and unwillingness, Zhou Xian finally gave the order to retreat. Although he would have to sacrifice a lot of people, he couldn't care less at this moment. Once the order was given, military orders would be obeyed. The Tatar cavalry quickly broke away from the mercenaries and started to look for an opportunity to retreat. But the two sides were still entangled before, so how could one side retreat just because they wanted to? Riding on the white dragon, Yang Chendong had already killed countless enemy cavalrymen. Seeing that the enemies around him were getting fewer and fewer, he guessed the other party's intention and shouted, "Entangle them and kill as many as you can. Order the independent regiment soldiers in the forest to shoot people if they can. If they can't shoot people, then shoot horses. We must strive to inflict the greatest damage to the enemy." Beta Persei and the guards who were responsible for protecting Yang Chendong's safety received the military order and immediately rode away to convey it. After receiving the military order, the entire mercenary army entangled the Tatar cavalry with the momentum of an army. With a crushing momentum, they left behind nearly 1,000 cavalrymen in a very short period of time. Zhou Xian was the first group of people to withdraw. On the way back, he naturally encountered the long-range attack of the two independent regiment firearms battalions that had long been prepared. This time they were not so lucky. Under the order to shoot people but not horses, many of the Tatar cavalrymen who were hiding on the side of their horses fell to the ground because their horses were shot. Their heads were bleeding and they suffered heavy losses. When Zhou Xian finally escaped back to Agador Dorji with the army, he discovered that out of the original 10,000 cavalrymen, only 6,000 had really escaped. Seriously counting, in addition to the 1,000 cavalrymen who were injured by the muskets at the beginning and another 1,000 cavalrymen who died during the battle, they had paid the price of nearly 2,000 cavalrymen when they finally escaped. In less than 2 hours they had lost 40% of their forces. Moreover, they were the most elite cavalrymen. This made Zhou Xian, who was the commanding general, feel very distressed. He rode up to Agador Dorji with a face full of anger. He wanted to ask why Agador Dorji did not bring the 10,000 Tatar cavalrymen when they clearly had the opportunity to win. Not only did they miss the opportunity to win, but they also lost so many brave warriors. Zhou Xian had just appeared, but before he could say anything, Agador Dorji spoke first. "How was it? I said that we should focus on probing. You must have seen that the enemy's musketeers were arranged in the southern forest. They are the biggest threat. If we don't get rid of them, the more cavalrymen we send, the greater our losses will be. Speaking of which, we still underestimated the enemy. Fortunately, the enemy's forces are limited. This time they also suffered a lot of casualties. If they want to face our attack again, they will need to send more troops. This way our other two routes will have a chance." As if talking to himself, Agador Dorji made a post-battle conclusion by answering his own questions. He actually forced Zhou Xian to not say a word. He originally wanted to criticize and complain, but he found that he no longer had the chance. This was because there was a trace of killing intent in Agador Dorji's eyes. He dared to guarantee that if he questioned his lord's words, he would be stripped of his military power. It was even possible that he would become a prisoner. Agador Dorji was an extremely selfish person. In order to achieve his goals, he was often unscrupulous. The fact that he was able to get away from his elder brother without falling out with him proved everything. When dealing with such a person, it was absolutely impossible to use common sense to reason with him. Knowing this, Zhou Xian wisely shut his mouth. His original questioning tone also changed to asking for medicine. Facing Zhou Xian's understanding, Agador Dorji was naturally very happy. He readily agreed to transfer the medical supplies in the army to treat the enemy's cavalrymen. As for the result of the previous defeat, both sides tacitly agreed not to mention it. It was as if it had never happened. Compared to the Tatar cavalrymen, the mercenaries' morale was indeed high and the situation was gratifying. In one battle they killed more than 2,800 cavalrymen and captured more than 1,000 enemy soldiers. More than 500 of the mercenaries' cavalrymen died and more than 800 were injured. The main reason was that the Jurchen cavalry suffered heavy losses. Most of the people who died were killed when the enemy first shot arrows at them. Arrange for the injured soldiers to be treated immediately. We can't let a tragic thing happen where people don't die on the battlefield and end up dying from injuries. Yang Qindong rode on the white dragon horse and said to the logistics battalion commander, Yang Air. Young master, please rest assured. Our logistics battalion has recently transferred 300 people to practice their medical skills. It has been quite effective. As the battalion commander, Beta Persei patted his chest and said, Very good. Clean up the battlefield. Take the captured horses and prisoners back to the first city. Let the people there see that the so-called elite Tatar cavalry is not invincible. Anyone who chooses to be the enemy of our mercenaries will make the biggest mistake of their life. Yang Qindong nodded, then reached out and patted Beta Persei's shoulder. If the medical officer has extra, treat the injuries of these Tatar cavalrymen. Maybe they will join our camp in the future. Yes, I will do my best. Beta Persei nodded in agreement. If it was someone else who said that to treat the injuries of the original enemy, he would definitely explode. But these words came from the sixth young master, so of course he would not object. But from the words "do your best," it could be seen that he still had some emotions. After quickly dealing with the post-war matters, Yang Qindong looked to the north and west. He muttered, The first step of the plan went well. The next step depends on the other two. Let Tiger's Mane come over. It should be time for his independent regiment to show its power. The messenger sent by Agar Dorji delivered the news of the battle in the southern forest in a timely manner. When the news came out, it was already a little out of shape. It was probably because the Tatar cavalry had won a great victory in the battle in the southern forest, which put a lot of pressure on the mercenaries. Next, they would definitely transfer troops to assist the southern forest. Then it was time for them to seize the opportunity. The first to arrive will be rewarded with 10,000 taels of silver. Ah, good. Haraluku said with a laugh. Then, when Du looked at the other side of the West River, there was a look of desire in his eyes. Unlike Agar Dorji, Haraluku was the kind of newborn calf that was not afraid of tigers. Since young, he had been shrouded in his father's halo. In addition, when he was born, his appearance was not obvious and was even a little ugly. This made him want to prove himself more than others. Now that he finally had the opportunity to lead an army alone, and the situation seemed to be very beneficial to him, he began to think about how to make contributions and show off his skills. He even wanted to use his efforts to tell everyone that he was not only Agar Dorji's son, but also a general who could fight well. Of course, Haraluku was not a hot-headed person. He still decided to see the enemy retreat first, then look for an opportunity to fight. And just as he was looking forward to it, on that night, the camp that was originally lit with torches suddenly became restless. Then from afar he could see the enemy troops leaving with torches. Chapter 7:11. Young Master, the enemy really did withdraw their troops. The scout who was ordered to keep an eye on the enemy's situation excitedly opened the door of the tent to report. This caused Haraluo, who had just fallen asleep, to immediately crawl out from under his blankets. Quickly bring me out to take a look. As soon as he fell asleep, Haraluo dreamt of himself charging across the West River, beating back the mercenaries and arriving at Beginning City. Who would have thought that the dream would come true so quickly? Following the scout, they arrived at the West River. What they saw was the scene of the enemy's torch squad leaving one after another. Although there weren't many torches, the remaining ones moved very frequently. In a short while he saw 4 to 5 groups of torches leaving the camp. Haraluo made a rough calculation in his heart and revealed a meaningful smile. These mercenaries are very careful. Do they think that I won't be able to detect their movements if they don't leave in large numbers? You underestimate the heroes of the world too much. Seeing that the mercenaries were using small groups to cover the retreat of the main army, Haraluo was even more certain that the enemy had sent reinforcements to the southern forest. After making up his mind, Haraluo said to the scout beside him, "Pass down my orders. The soldiers will wake up at 4 in the morning and eat at 5 in the morning. After that, the entire army will cross the river. This time we must be the first army to reach Beginning City." Young Master's wise. The scout who had the same idea didn't forget to flatter him. This caused Haraluo to laugh even more loudly. After returning to the tent, Haraluo didn't feel sleepy anymore. He just sat there and waited for the arrival of dawn. After a long time of shouting and cheering, the sky gradually brightened. While the morning fog still lingered on the West River, making it impossible to see the situation on the other side clearly, the 5,000 elite Tatar cavalry had already finished their breakfast. They boarded the wooden rafts that had been prepared earlier and left across the river. Perhaps it was because of the mist on the river, or perhaps the enemy had really retreated. The 5,000 Tatar cavalry actually arrived on the other side of the West River without any obstruction. As soon as they arrived, Haraluo loudly announced the order to attack. He wanted to take advantage of the fact that the enemy wasn't ready to launch a surprise attack and obtain victory. Once the order was given, the 5,000 Tatar cavalry mounted their horses and brandished their swords, charging straight toward the mercenary camp 3 miles away. His shouts could be heard from far away, drifting along with the wind. What was surprising was that there was no movement from the opposite side of the barracks despite all the shouting. This was very illogical. Whether they were panicking or going out of the camp to fight, there had to be a plan. This kind of disregard was really a little strange. Haliruo's face was filled with doubt as he charged at the front of the group. However, a thought quickly surfaced in his mind. The mercenaries must have escaped under the cover of the night. Perhaps they knew that the southern Xianwood forest could not be defended, so they had already retreated to the beginning city. If that was the case, then he would lead the large army straight in and charge to the beginning city. The first merit would undoubtedly belong to him. Ha ha ha. Thinking of this, Haliruo laughed heartily. His 5,000 Tatar cavalry had already arrived in front of the camp. As expected, there was still no movement. From the looks of it, there was no one inside. Many of the Tatar cavalrymen who were originally nervous had relaxed expressions on their faces. Search and see if there is anything valuable left behind. After all, this was an abandoned camp. Just the tents left behind were worth some silver taels. The Tatar cavalry eyed the tents covetously as they dismounted and charged into the tents. Some of the Tatar cavalry took the initiative to stand guard. It had to be said that elites were elites. Even with a great victory at hand, they were still able to maintain a calm formation. It was precisely because these people abided by the rules of war that they were able to escape this disaster. On the other hand, the Tatar cavalry who were eager to obtain the spoils of war had already been locked onto by the god of death the moment they charged into the green tents. Boom! Without any warning, a huge explosion suddenly sounded from a tent. A Tatar horseman who had entered the tent, as well as 5 horsemen standing outside, were immediately sent flying into the air by the powerful explosion. And all of this was only the beginning. It was like a chain reaction, like dominoes being pushed down by someone. Explosions sounded one after another at this moment. The nearby military tents also began to explode continuously at this moment. Those who had entered the tent, those who hadn't entered but had already walked to the front of the tent, as well as some Tatar cavalrymen who were staring at the tent, had all become targets. Amidst the continuous sounds of explosions, these people were engulfed in a sea of fire. What's going on? The continuous explosions shattered Haliruo's eardrums, but as the commander he still didn't forget to shout out loud. Even though his voice wasn't even worth mentioning in front of the powerful explosions, and no one could hear him clearly, he still continued to shout out loud. It was destined that no one would answer his question. There was only the continuous explosions and the sudden sounds of killing. At the moment of the explosion, a group of over 5,000 cavalrymen had already surrounded the area. Firearms appeared in the hands of these cavalrymen. They were the main force of the independent regiment that had retreated to this place and returned. Apart from the 2 firearms battalions that were left behind in the southern forest, the remaining 14 independent battalions were all gathered here. The instant the booby traps were detonated, they rushed out as planned, quickly surrounding the panicked and disorderly Tatar cavalry. The greatest damage caused by the explosions wasn't the psychological pressure on the Tatar cavalry, but rather the deterrence of the war horses. What animals feared the most was fire and powerful sound waves. The exploding mines seemed to have both of these. The war horses that hadn't experienced such a situation were naturally afraid from the bottom of their hearts. At this moment they instinctively neighed, jumped, and even ran wildly without knowing where to go. It seemed that only by doing so could they relax a little. The usually obedient war horses suddenly jumped crazily, completely disobeying orders. Many unprepared Tatar cavalrymen were thrown off their horses. Even some of the cavalrymen with good riding skills could only lie on their horses to prevent themselves from being thrown off. It was completely impossible for them to command the war horses. At this time the mercenaries appeared. While they were still far away, the bullets of their firearms whistled through the air. One shot after another hit the uncontrolled and unprepared Tatar cavalrymen. Blood splattered everywhere. One by one the cavalrymen were shot in the chest or body. They fell off their horses or directly fell to the ground, ending their young lives. Enemy attack, counterattack, prepare to counterattack. The sudden situation in front of him caused a short circuit in Hilario's mind. Then, as if he was suddenly awakened, he began to shout loudly. However, he only managed to shout twice before he was thrown off the back of the horse by the frenzied horse. The intense pain caused him to fall to the ground, unable to make a sound for a long time. It wasn't just one or two people who suffered the same fate as Hilario, but at least a few hundred cavalrymen. The rest of the Tatar cavalry were either injured from being thrown off their horses, or were still fighting against their horses. Some were even killed by the mercenaries' long-range muskets. There were less than 1,000 Tatar cavalrymen who were able to maintain a certain level of fighting strength. However, these 1,000 cavalrymen were already scared out of their wits. When they saw the sudden change in the army, they pulled out their sabers. However, when they saw the number of mercenaries around them, some of the smarter ones obediently put down their sabers, dismounted and surrendered. Even their commander didn't make a sound of resistance. The other party used firearms that could easily take a person's life from hundreds of feet away. Their morale was inferior, their numbers were inferior, and their weapons were inferior as well. How could they fight this battle? The most precious thing to a person was their life. If they surrendered, they would live. If they resisted, they would die. Their deaths were worthless. As long as they weren't fools, they would know how to make the choice. A total of 14 battalions of independent soldiers charged over like wolves and tigers. They either raised their Type 81 rifles or held their longbows. There were even some who held horse lashings. Step by step they closed in on the enemy. In the eyes of these soldiers, killing intent was overflowing. If anyone wanted to continue resisting, they wouldn't mind silencing them. It was precisely this kind of aura that caused the Tatar cavalrymen who originally wanted to resist to become extremely obedient. After all, no one was willing to joke around with their lives. Especially when there was a surging river behind them. With nowhere else to go, it seemed that surrendering was the only way to survive. As they continued to advance, they continued to capture captives. The 5,000 Tatar cavalrymen had completely lost their morale under the sudden attack of a booby trap. When their commander, Harachu, was knocked unconscious by his warhorse, they became people without a leader. They were successfully incorporated into the independent regiment. One by one they threw down their sabers, jumped off their warhorses and surrendered. The pitiful Harachu was tied up tightly while he was still unconscious. His identity was even betrayed by his subordinates, and he became the target of Tiger's Mane's care. Vice Commander Xan, look after these people. Bring them all back to New City. This person needs to be taken care of. I'm afraid that he will come in handy in the upcoming battle. Pointing at the still unconscious Harachu, Tiger's Mane laughed heartily. He then led the 10 soldiers of the independent regiment away from the Xi River and headed towards the north slope. Chapter 7:12. North Slope. General Gulang, who had also received Agar Dorji's message, was in high spirits. As a general who had rendered meritorious service, he wanted to obtain military merits more than anyone else. However, the North Slope was difficult to attack, so he was unable to fulfill his ambition. Now, Lord Gulang said that the battle in the southern forest was going smoothly. After the battle, many mercenaries were eliminated. In order to defend there, it was very likely that they would transfer troops from other places to the southern forest. In this way, Gulang's opportunity had appeared. The so-called 10,000 taels of silver for being the first to attack the beginning city did not excite Glenn. He was more interested in this first contribution. This was also a good opportunity for him to wash away his shame. Therefore, after he received the news, he had been sending people to watch every move of the mercenaries on the North Slope. However, the more anxious he was, the more there was no news. Half an afternoon and a night passed, but there were still no clues. Just when Gulang was a little impatient and was thinking about whether to send people to ask Lord Gulang again, the scout finally sent news that the mercenaries on the north slope were moving. They seemed to be changing their guard. A large number of people were moving, but because of the terrain, they could not see clearly what was happening. They must have received orders to send reinforcements to the battlefield in the southern forest. After the scout finished reporting the news, Gulang was excited and made some arbitrary conclusions. General, if that's the case, why don't we attack now and attract the enemy here? This is equivalent to giving Lord Gulang more opportunities. The scout misunderstood and asked. There's no need for that. Gulang immediately shook his head. This was an opportunity for him to perform meritorious service. How could he give it to others? Therefore, while shaking his head, he said aloud, Lord Gulang has already sent an order for us to find a way to rush to the beginning city. This is the greatest support for Lord Gulang, understand? Understood, General. The scout replied as if he had understood the situation. After convincing the scout, Gulang said with a slightly excited expression, How about this? You find a way to get as close to the enemy as possible and watch their movements. Once you find that they have finished deploying their troops, inform me. Then prepare the entire army and launch a fierce attack in 2 hours. Gulang still had some brains. He did not attack immediately because he wanted to create an opportunity for the other party to divide their forces. Only in this way could he seize the opportunity to make contributions and rush to the beginning city. His goal was to directly rush into the city. By then, the mercenaries would no longer have a base behind them. With a pincer attack, it would be the time to destroy the mercenaries. If he could really do this, Gulang would have defeated the war god of the great Ming dynasty. As a result, his name would resound throughout the entire grassland. At that time, who would dare to look down on him? At that time, he would be able to raise his voice even in front of Lord Agar Dorje. Glenn was very excited and looked forward to the future. However, he did not know that the mercenaries on the north slope were not really splitting up. They were just faking it. They had even dug a large enough pit to trap horses on the top of the slope, and had even joined forces with the Tiger's main independent regiment that had rushed over from the West River. They were just waiting for him to attack, and then they would give him a head-on blow and take him down in one fell swoop. This was originally one of Yang Qindong's plans. First, he would engage in a battle with the main force of the Tatar army on the battlefield that was most suitable for cavalry charges. In order to show the enemy that he was weak, he deliberately lowered the power of the continuous fire guns. This was to make Agar Dorje underestimate the enemy and think that he would definitely mobilize troops from the other two places in order to defend the southern forest. Once this news spread to the West River and the North Slope, they would fall into the trap and send out troops. In this way, he could gather the superior forces to launch a counterattack and achieve his goal of defeating them one by one. In this way, he could gather the main force of the Tatar army again and achieve his goal of defeating them in one battle. Gulang, who did not know about this, was eager to make contributions. When he heard that the mercenaries on the top of the slope might have split up, he looked for an opportunity to kill his way up. Only half an hour after he received the news, the mercenaries who rushed to support the southern forest should have gone far away and would not be back for a while. The Tatar cavalry under the slope had begun to attack. Although it was said to be a slope, it was not very urgent. It was just that the slope was longer and was not suitable for the cavalry to charge. However, if the cavalry worked hard, they would still be able to charge up. It was just that they would need more time. This time it was no longer a probing attack. The first charge was to send out 2,000 cavalry as the vanguard. Different from the previous two charges, these 2,000 cavalry were only met with sporadic resistance and had already charged halfway up the slope. Looking at the top of the slope, there were only a few hundred mercenaries who were giving out bows and arrows. Haha, as expected. Seeing that the front army was progressing so smoothly, Gulang laughed endlessly. He finally gave the order for the entire army to attack. Immediately, 10,000 Tatar cavalry loudly shouted and charged up the slope from the bottom of the mountain. On the top of the slope, the independent regiment's commander Tiger Mane and the cavalry reinforced regiment's commander Windchaser used binoculars to stare at the Tatar cavalry under the slope. The two of them revealed a look of disbelief. What a good-for-nothing. Even if it is a charge, it should not be so fast. Windchaser shook his head and put down the binoculars in his hand. He sighed and said, "Ah, good for a good-for-nothing. Our plan can be carried out even more smoothly. We can go support the southern forest even faster. The young master has been waiting for our good news. Tiger, Mane also put down the binoculars in his hand. Then he reached for his waist and took out a 54 handgun. It was the basic equipment for mercenary officers and above. It was also a symbol of status. With Tiger Mane's status, he had already been equipped with this kind of high-level weapon. Now that he took it out, he was preparing to launch a counterattack. Windchaser also took out a 54 handgun from his waist. Then he carefully wiped it again and again. When the entire body of the gun was wiped until it seemed like it was reflecting light, he opened the safety and aimed it at the top of the slope. This time he also wanted to have fun with a handgun. Seeing Windchaser's excited appearance, Tiger Mane smiled and kindly reminded him. Commander Windchaser, a handgun is not like a spear. The shooting distance is limited. If it is too far, it won't have any effect. I know. Windchaser repeatedly nodded. However, it could be seen that Windchaser was still a bit nervous. It was just like the first time he held a blade and rode on a horse. The two commanders only hid and didn't move. The other mercenaries also waited in their positions. Just like this, the Tatar cavalry charged halfway up the slope and into their line of sight. Deng Yu, who was in charge of luring the enemy, looked like he was going all out to stop the advance of the Tatar cavalry. However, it was obvious that because of the small number of people, he was powerless. Seeing the enemy rushing up, he immediately panicked and shouted to retreat. Immediately, hundreds of cavalry turned around and fled. That clean and neat appearance attracted bursts of laughter from the Tatar cavalry behind. Under the laughter, Gulang also rushed to the top of the slope with the main cavalry. He also saw the scene of Deng Yu leading the cavalry to retreat. Good. Now we have successfully reached the top of the slope. Next, it is time for us to make a contribution. Boys, charge together with this general. The first to reach the beginning city will be rewarded with 100 silver taels. After Gulang shouted to boost the morale, the Tatar cavalry in front of him shouted excitedly. Then they rushed forward crazily. They wanted to follow behind Deng Yu to see if they could kill the enemy in the process of chasing. At the same time, they also wanted to get closer to the beginning city. In this way, Deng Yu ran in front. Behind him, there were tens of thousands of Tatar cavalry waving their sabers. From time to time, there would be people shooting arrows. Although the distance was still far and it was impossible to shoot, it did have a big deterrent effect. Deng Yu, who was running in front, looked back from time to time. When he saw that the Tatar cavalry had indeed fallen into the trap and caught up with him, the corner of his eyes showed a trace of a proud smile. He looked back and saw the inconspicuous road sign on the side of the road. He said loudly to the cavalry warriors beside him, "We will soon reach the horse trap area." Everyone split up according to the plan. The mercenary cavalry who had been informed in advance of the trap immediately split into two sides, leaving the dangerous area and continuing to run forward. Some of the Tatar cavalry who were less than a mile behind also noticed this scene, but they didn't take it to heart. In their opinion, the enemy was probably in a panic and didn't know where to go. Since that was the case, they would just chase after them. Perhaps they were eager to make a contribution, perhaps they were impatient and careless, or perhaps they were arrogant and underestimated the enemy. In short, the Tatar cavalry broke into the horse trap that the mercenaries had already dug. Previously, they had considered the large number of enemies, so when the horse trap was dug, the scale was very large. It was more than 30 meters wide and 3 miles long. It consumed a lot of manpower and material resources, and now it could finally be put to use. Without any surprise, the Tatar cavalry fell into the trap. Before the first row of cavalry realized what was going on, their warhorses' heads sank and they fell into the 4-meter-deep pit. This was only the beginning. More and more Tatar cavalry fell into the pit like dumplings. They were advancing dauntlessly, wave after wave, and there was no break in between. One after another, more than half of the 2,000 vanguard cavalry fell into the pit. This finally attracted the attention of the other cavalry behind them. More and more Tatar cavalry pulled on the reins of their warhorses and stopped in place. What's going on? General Glenn rushed over under the protection of a group of soldiers. When he saw the scene in front of him, he could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. More than 1,000 cavalry fell into the pit, and most of them were injured because of the trampling of their warhorses. Some of them were even covered in blood and died. Chapter 7:13. Bastards, damn mercenaries. Seeing that he had lost more than 10% of his troops, Glenn was naturally furious. When he raised his head to look at the mercenaries who were still retreating along the path, he said angrily, continue to chase after them. They don't have any more tricks up their sleeves. I want to catch them and tear them into pieces. In Glenn's view, this was clearly the last resort of the mercenaries. This also proved that the other party had no other tricks up their sleeves. Otherwise, how could they set up such a big trap? It was too late and they didn't have time to rescue the cavalry who fell into the pit. After asking them to think of a way to save themselves, Glenn led most of the cavalry and continued to pursue the enemy. For safety reasons, he deliberately sent a cavalry team of 100 people to walk in front to prevent the appearance of traps. Obviously, this kind of worry was unnecessary. Large-scale horse traps required a lot of manpower and resources. Even if the mercenaries had individual shovels in their hands, it would be much easier to dig them out. However, such a large-scale trap with a wide area was not something that could be easily dug out. After chasing for another 3 miles, they were still very safe. This also made the Tatar cavalry, who was originally nervous, began to feel relieved. They began to speed up. Glenn, who was walking in the team, thought that at this speed, they should be able to reach the beginning city around noon. Disaster always came when there was the most hope, just like the darkness before dawn. Just when the Tatar cavalry thought that they saw hope and discovered that the distance between them and the mercenaries was shortened from 1 mile to less than 300 meters, suddenly, a loud gunshot broke the previous silence. Tiger's Mane, who was hiding in the grass on both sides of the road, opened fire. With the help of the half-meter-tall grass, he fired the first shot and hit a centurion who was shouting to urge the cavalry to move forward. The gunshot was an order. This shot led Windchaser to fire a shot as well. It was a pity that he still needed to practice his marksmanship. Although the distance was less than 40 meters, this shot still missed and didn't hurt anyone. But it didn't matter. After this shot, it attracted the attention of the 4 independent battalions who were lying in ambush at the same time. They were the only firearm battalion other than the 2 Southern Forest battalions. The 4 battalions had a total of 1,600 men. Gunshots rang out in unison, and in just one wave they killed the 1,000 Tatar cavalry charging at the front. When the Tatar cavalrymen were killed one after another, the entire Tatar cavalrymen were shocked and panicked. At this moment, along with the second wave of gunfire, the mercenaries who were fleeing stopped in their tracks. Not only that, but thousands of cavalrymen also appeared beside them. They brandished their sabers or held bows and arrows as they charged towards them. The arrogant Tatar cavalry was stunned by the sudden change in front of them. They watched as their companions were killed one by one on their horses. When they saw the cavalry getting closer and closer, many arrows were already falling in front of them. Some of their companions were even injured. They began to feel fear. The vanguard cavalry was killed by spears or arrows one by one. They were unable to exert enough fighting power. It was like a fist being held down by someone. When they were unable to kill the enemy, the strength of the Tatar cavalry was suppressed to the greatest extent. They could only passively take a beating. Don't panic, the warriors in front will attack the enemy with your sabers, the warriors in the back will be ready to attack. Seeing that the situation wasn't good, Gulang yelled. He knew that he had fallen into the enemy's trap, but at this moment he didn't have a better solution. If he retreated now, he might not have the chance to make a comeback. So he could only endure. The shout of the commander calmed down some of the Tatar cavalrymen. Some of them brandished their sabers and charged forward, while others held their bows and arrows ready to counterattack. After all, they had lived on horseback since they were young. Although there was an unknown change in the situation, their good psychological quality allowed them to quickly calm down. Throw grenades and break the enemy's formation. Prepare the bazookas and break their psychological defense. Tiger's Mane, who was hiding on the side of the road, was also shocked by the Tatar cavalrymen's fighting spirit. Fortunately, he still had a backup plan that could break the enemy's psychological defense. Under the order, some of the soldiers of the independent regiment took out the weapons they had prepared for a long time from their backs or waists. Tiger's Mane specifically asked them to stay behind when the 3 divisions of the Cold Front Division left. There were still a lot of grenades, and although there weren't many bazookas, it was still enough to deter the enemy. When these heavy weapons were taken out and activated, countless grenades were thrown at the Tatar cavalrymen like rain. There were also 2 bazookas loaded with shells and began to fire. The situation on the battlefield instantly became very tense. Boom 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 boom. Boom boom boom. Boom. First there was a series of loud bangs from the grenades. They smashed a huge hole in the Tatar cavalry, causing countless warhorses to lose their composure amidst their neighs. They no longer listened to the orders of the cavalrymen and danced wildly. 2 rocket launchers were launched to completely suppress the Tatar cavalry's charge. When one of the rocket launchers landed 200 meters away in the enemy's main camp, the fighting spirit that had just been gathered due to Gulang's words suffered a heavy blow in an instant. Under the roar of the bazooka, the cavalrymen were completely stunned by the scene of flames and debris flying in the air. They had never seen such a situation before and didn't know how to deal with it. The warhorses under them became the fuse that led to their final defeat. The warhorses were terrified and ran for their lives. They didn't care about the feelings of their masters and didn't listen to any of their orders. It was a mess, a complete mess. In the chaos, horses bumped into each other and people bumped into each other. Before the mercenary cavalrymen rushed to the front, the Tatar cavalrymen had already fallen into the process of killing each other. One after another, the cavalrymen were thrown off their horses. One after another, the warhorses crashed into each other and fell to the ground. This time, Gulang wasn't spared. After all, when the warhorse went crazy, he didn't care if it was an ordinary soldier or a general who commanded thousands of troops. Under extreme fear, they only knew how to instinctively run and crash in all directions. Before Gulang could continue to issue orders, he was thrown to the ground by the warhorse. Then he was unlucky enough to be trampled by another warhorse that came out of nowhere. A weight of more than 1,000 kilograms pressed down on his body, causing Glenn to involuntarily open his mouth and widen his eyes. A series of crisp sounds rang in his ears. It was the sound of his ribs being crushed. Piff-a-feff. A mouthful of blood spurted out from Gulang's mouth without warning. When the warhorse finally trampled over him, he was unfortunately trampled by another warhorse from afar. Under the continuous trampling, the only thing Gulang could do was to keep coughing up blood. Then the strength in his body started to disappear. At the same time, the blood in his body and the strength in his breath also disappeared. In such a chaotic world, Gulang reluctantly closed his eyes and breathed his last breath. Gulang was dead. With the death of their general, the soldiers under him lost their commander and the formation became even more chaotic. In addition, there were more than 1 or 2 Tatar cavalrymen who suffered the same fate as Glenn. When the number of Tatar cavalrymen gradually grew to a certain scale, their will to resist was completely worn away. The remaining Tatar cavalrymen only wanted to escape from this purgatory of the human world. They had no other thoughts. Charge. Kill. Dismount and throw your swords. Those who surrender will not be killed. At this moment, a large number of mercenary cavalry arrived. Taking advantage of this unstoppable momentum and chaos, they slaughtered their way into the chaotic Tatar cavalry as if they were in a no-man's land. Raising their swords, they chopped down one enemy after another under their horses. Under the strong morale, many of the defeated Tatar cavalrymen chose to surrender. After all, knowing that they would die if they resisted, it was not bravery but foolishness. 10,000 Tatar cavalrymen suffered heavy losses, especially under the attacks of muskets, grenades and rocket launchers. Their will to fight was disintegrated. In the end, they abandoned their remaining will to fight and their dignity. They became defeated soldiers and captives. Who? Tiger Edge let out a long sigh and stood up from the grass. He then looked at Wind Chaser, who had an equally excited expression, and said, "Let's hurry up. The young master is still waiting for us to reinforce and regroup." Wind Chaser also knew that they were able to obtain victory here because of the support of the independent firearms unit. Since they had won, what they needed to do now was to rush to the southern forest with the fastest speed and meet up with the 6th young master to annihilate the last of the Tatar cavalrymen. "Come, hurry up and clean up the battlefield. If anyone doesn't surrender, kill them. Don't waste time." The will to fight had been defeated, so the next step was much easier. Clean up the battlefield and capture the captives. Wind Chaser had already given the order. The soldiers under him still wanted to go to the southern forest and continue to make contributions. In their impatience, Whenever they encountered a Tatar cavalryman who showed resistance or didn't surrender, they would kill them without saying anything. It was precisely because of such cruel actions that the Tatar cavalry became afraid. These mercenaries really didn't take human lives seriously. When they saw someone coming over to persuade them to surrender, they didn't dare to hesitate and threw down their swords and dismounted from their horses. 10,000 cavalrymen, 3,000 died, 2,000 were injured and 5,000 were captured. And to complete these actions it only took them 2 hours. Could be said that they were very fast. Send 1,000 cavalrymen and a battalion of firearms soldiers to transport the captives and the wounded back to the beginning city. The rest of you follow me to the southern forest. Hurry. Seeing that the situation was settled, Tiger's Mane's voice was slightly anxious. He was really worried about the young master's safety. Chapter 7:14. Southern Forest. Since the morning, Agador had issued a decision to send out a small group of cavalry to provoke the enemy. According to Agador, what they had to do now was to constantly put pressure on the mercenaries on the opposite side, forcing them to withdraw their troops from the West River and the North Slope battlefield, creating an opportunity for the Tatar cavalry to advance. In this regard, General Zhou Xian expressed a different opinion. In his opinion, since they already knew the strength of the enemy's army, what they should do now was to immediately launch a decisive battle and rely on their advantage in numbers to severely injure the enemy, instead of launching a probing attack to give the enemy more time to prepare. General Zhou, you have seen the strength of the mercenaries, especially their firearms, which can be said to be accurate and long-range. Do you think that if we fight head-on there will be a winner in the end? Injuring the enemy and losing 800 of our own men is not what I want. I have never thought of swallowing the mercenaries. To be honest, we don't have that big of an appetite. Our goal is to drive them away and occupy the beginning city. So, don't ask for a battle. Let's focus on the overall situation. After seeing Zhou Xian ask for a battle several times in a row, Agador finally lost his patience and said this somewhat angrily. Seeing that Agador had made up his mind, Zhou Xian could do nothing but feel heartache. Walking out of the military camp, he looked up at the sky helplessly and then said sadly, "God wants me to die." Compared with Agar Dorji's so-called view of the overall situation, in Zhou Xian's view, it was just a manifestation of timidity. It was because this person was afraid of death, afraid that the army would be severely damaged, and afraid that his own strength would be damaged, so he placed his hopes on the other two routes. But in fact, whether it was Hariloku or Glen, Zhou Xian did not think highly of them. Of these two, one was born as a son of a rich family, and the other was a general of a defeated army. Both of them belonged to the kind of people who had no strategy. It was simply self-deceiving and extremely unrealistic and irresponsible to put the hope of victory on them. It was just that Agador believed too much in the saying that numbers could defeat everything. He didn't listen to her advice at all, which made Zhou Xian feel helpless. The only thing he could do was to watch small troops step forward and serve as whetstones for the mercenaries. That's right, when the mercenaries faced the Tatar cavalry, they did not choose to charge with their entire army. Instead, they chose to send small groups to harass the Tatar cavalry. After dispatching the main force of the independent regiment, Yang Qindong was left with less than 5,000 cavalry. Facing more than 10,000 Tatar cavalry, unless he was willing to take out all the firearms in his warehouse, it would be extremely difficult for him to win. Even Yang Qindong was prepared for the worst. If he couldn't hold on, he would slowly retreat and use the cooperation of the two gun battalions to exchange space for time. As long as the enemies at the West River and the North Slope were dealt with, he would have more troops to deploy. At that time it would be time for him to launch an all-out counterattack. Unexpectedly, the other party seemed to know what he was thinking and cooperated with him. They did not choose to charge with their entire army, but instead sent small groups to harass the enemy. This was exactly what he wanted. After discussing with the two regimental commanders Yella and Lu Zhua, he decided to send a small group of cavalry to confront the enemy head-on and treat it as actual combat training. It was true that Agador brought elite Tatar cavalry, but the strength of the mercenaries was not bad either. In particular, their training was several times better than the other forces. It could be said that the combat strength of the cavalry was increasing every day. In addition, their cavalry sabers were sharp and tough, which increased their chances of winning by a bit. Now that the other party wanted to fight with fewer people, of course they would help. In this way, the other side would send out a few hundred people, and the other side would send out a few hundred people. Both sides began a cavalry charge outside the vast southern forest. A cavalry charge focused on morale and proficiency in horsemanship. One had to know how to use the warhorse as a part of one's body and control it flexibly. Of course, the sharpness of the weapon also played a large role. In terms of morale, there was nothing to say about the mercenaries. Yang Chendong, who did not lack money, gave them high rewards in terms of money. Not only that, but being a soldier under him also gave them a good social status. Not only would a soldier bring glory to his family, but he could also feed his family. Their horsemanship had also improved under hard training. Even if they could not compare to the elites of the Mongol cavalry, normal cavalry would not be a match for them. Furthermore, the cavalry swords were made by the Chimeric City Munitions Factory, so the materials used were abundant. Its sharpness and toughness were unparalleled, which made up for some of the shortcomings in horsemanship. They had high morale, excellent horsemanship and excellent weapons. In a true battle of 100 cavalry against 100 cavalry, the mercenary cavalry would not be afraid of anyone. This was especially so when they had the 3-to-3 tactic. Although it was not as effective as on land, it was enough to increase their combat strength. All in all, in a cavalry charge with equal numbers, the mercenaries were not afraid of anyone. Even if the opponent was the Tatar cavalry and the elites of the Tatar cavalry, the outcome would be the same. This was evident from the 3 consecutive battles. In the first battle they killed 60 enemy cavalry and lost 40 of their own. In the second battle they killed 70 enemy cavalry and lost 43 of their own. In the third battle they killed 55 enemy cavalry and lost 45 of their own. The first and second battles were fought by the Nuzan cavalry. In the third battle it was Lu Zhua's 2nd Cavalry Regiment. Just from the results of the battle, the Nuzan cavalry was indeed very powerful, worthy of their name. Of course, this result had a lot to do with the cavalry swords in their hands. In the end, the results were mostly because the enemy's cavalry swords were broken and could not fight anymore. After 3 consecutive battles, the mercenaries' morale was even higher. On the other hand, the Tatar cavalry were not in a good situation. General Su He's face was even gloomier. She thought that the previous defeat was because the other side used guns and had good tactical cooperation. She was defeated by the combination of inside and outside. But now it seemed that there was no need for tactics. With the same number of soldiers, they were no match for the enemy. This made him have another thought. Was it a mistake to choose to be the enemy of the mercenaries this time? The Tatar cavalry needed to find a new base because of the lack of provisions, but did it have to be the beginning city? But it was obviously too late to say this now. The war had already begun, and it was no longer a situation where one side could retreat as they wished. For example, if they ordered a retreat now, it would be a great blow to the Tatar cavalry's morale. If the mercenaries chased after them at this time, it was likely to lead to a one-sided battle. If that was the case, they would lose without a fight. Feeling that if the battle continued like this, even if there was good news from the West River and the North Slope, the morale of the troops would still be damaged. Su He once again walked into the tent of Commander-in-Chief Agar Dorj and put forward his request. That was, they could not continue fighting. Sir, we can't continue fighting. After 3 battles we have lost. The morale of the troops has begun to become unstable. Su He said with a worried face. Yes, Agar Dorj, who was sitting at the head of the tent, replied absent-mindedly. Sir, what are you thinking about? Seeing that Agar Dorj's expression was a little ugly, Su He asked casually out of concern. It's nothing. It's just that the scouts we sent out suddenly stopped responding. There's also no news from the West River and the North Slope. It's been almost a day. Do you think there's a problem? Agar Dorj hesitated for a moment, but considering that Su He was his general, there were some things that he should not hide from him. So he carefully told him what had happened. What? Originally, Su He thought that Agar Dorj was too tired from the battle and had some problems with his body. However, when he heard this question, his jaw dropped in shock. The scouts' communication with the outside world had been cut off. What did this mean? It meant that they had become deaf and blind, which was a taboo in war. When 2 armies fought, although it did not necessarily require one to know the situation of the other side, one should at least know where one's own troops were. But now they were not even clear about their own situation. What could it be other than a big problem? How long ago did this happen? He felt a strong sense of crisis, and he was even more anxious to know the specific details of the matter. After the battle yesterday afternoon, there was no news from the outside world. At first I thought that the scouts might have gone to rest because it was dark, but there was still no news until dawn. In the morning I sent out some more scouts and told them that no matter what happened, they had to report back within 4 hours. But now it has been 6 hours and not a single scout has returned. As Agadorji spoke, he looked at Zhou Xian. It seemed that he was asking for her advice and wanted to hear her opinion. It could be seen that Agadorji still had a trace of hope in his eyes. Perhaps he was still thinking that the scouts had been delayed by something and that they would return to report to him after a while. Zhou Xi's mind was much calmer than Agadorji's. What was a scout? They were the most flexible people in an army. They were all warriors that were picked out of 100. Not only were their individual qualities strong, but their reactions were also very agile. Under normal circumstances, it was rare for a mission to go wrong when it was assigned to them. But now there was no news from all the scouts that were sent out. There could only be one possibility, and that was that there was a collective problem. In other words, there should have been an inescapable net set up around them long ago, completely enveloping them. Chapter 7:15. That was the only way for such an outcome to occur. In the face of such an obvious problem, Agadorji, as the commander-in-chief, still had a fluke in fantasy mentality. Zhou Xian was so angry that she couldn't say a word. However, this wasn't the time to pursue the matter. Instead, he had to solve the problem. Although there was anger in her heart, Zhou Xian still suppressed the anger in her heart. She tried to say in a calm but anxious tone, "Your Excellency, I'm afraid things are not good now." "How is it not looking good?" Hearing Zhou Xi's analysis, Agadorji's heart skipped a beat. "My lord, scouts are the strongest army. Even if they don't complete the mission well, they should still be able to return and report back. But now that they can't even do that, it can only mean that something has happened to them. Not only them, but I'm afraid that young Master Hala and General Gulang aren't in a good situation either." Zhou Xian voiced out his suspicions. "They aren't in a good situation either? That can't be. They have a total of 15,000 cavalrymen, and how many mercenaries do they have? Their main force can't even move in front of us, so how could they have the strength to attack us?" Agadorji said with a look of disbelief. "My lord, now is not the time to be thinking about luck. We didn't know how strong the mercenaries are before, but after these 2 days, it's obvious that we underestimated them. Since that's the case, anything is possible. For safety's sake, I suggest that we retreat immediately and meet up with young Master Hala and General Gulang's troops." Zhou Xian didn't dare to take any chances. A commander was walking on a single plank bridge. Being careful was one of the necessary qualities. "Retreat now? Is it that serious?" Agadorji finally looked at the situation seriously, his expression becoming more and more serious. "Yes," Zhou Xian said in a very positive tone. Previously they were worried that a sudden retreat would cause unnecessary trouble or even some unnecessary losses. But now it seemed that there was no other choice but to retreat. It was better than being annihilated one by one. In the face of Zhou Xi's resolute attitude, Agadorji's face finally crumbled. If the situation is as serious as the general says, then we should retreat. However, the arrangements will depend on the general's plan." "Alright, I'll arrange it now. It's already evening now. I'll immediately arrange for the army to start a fire and prepare a meal. When the sky is completely dark, we'll retreat overnight." Zhou Xian cupped his fists with a solemn expression. "We'll do as you say." Agadorji's mind was already in a mess because of these words. He could no longer make any correct judgments and could only listen to his subordinate. Zhou Xian finally left the barracks. As soon as he came out, he took a deep breath and looked at the mercenary camp 5 miles away. He then narrowed his eyes and called a guard and said, "Order the army to start a fire and prepare a meal immediately. Also, arrange for 100 cavalry to challenge the mercenaries." The guard had a puzzled look on his face. Previously the general was against such a small army fighting. It was no different from sending them to their deaths, and it would be a blow to their morale. Why did the general change his mind in such a short period of time? But since it was the general's order, of course he would obey. After cupping his fists, he turned around and made the arrangements. After watching the guard leave, Zhou Xian looked at the mercenary camp again and murmured, I underestimated you, but once we leave this time, the next time we come, we will definitely let you know the power of the Tatar cavalry. Mercenary camp. Yang Qindong was resting in the big tent when Beta Persei suddenly entered the tent to report that the Tatars had sent another 100 cavalry to challenge them. They sent people again? Yang Qindong raised his head when he heard this. A trace of doubt flashed in his eyes. Yes, they sent another 100-men team. They are now 2 miles away from our camp and have already set up a formation. Beta Persei nodded and replied. Then arrange for the 2nd Regiment to send a company of brothers to meet them. Oh, by the way, call Commander Yella and Lu Zhou to come over for a meeting. After Yang Qindong finished arranging, he instructed again. For some reason he felt a faint sense of uneasiness in his heart. Beta Persei left, but after a cup of tea he reappeared. Along with him were the commander of the Nuzan Cavalry Regiment, Yella, and the commander of the 2nd Regiment, Lu Zhou. Hello, 6th Young Master. As soon as the 2 regimental commanders entered the tent, they were extremely respectful. You're welcome, take a seat wherever you like. Beta Persei served the tea. Yang Qindong invited the 2 regimental commanders to sit in front of him with a smile on his face. As soon as the 2 of them sat down, he said, It's almost dark, and the Tatars have sent troops to challenge us again. What do the 2 of you think? Originally, the 2 of them were receiving tea from Beta Persei, but when they suddenly heard this, they were both stunned. Then the 2 regimental commanders looked at each other and fell into deep thought. Since it was the 6th young master who asked the question, it naturally wouldn't be so simple. Previously, the 2 of them didn't take this matter seriously. They thought that since the other party had challenged them 3 times in a day, it wouldn't be a big deal if there was a 4th time. But now they didn't dare to think this way. Those who could become regimental commanders were those who were favored by Yang Qindong in the field of military affairs. They all had some skills and some of them were even quite capable. Now that they were reminded, the 2 of them thought for a while and found the problem. Could it be that they're hiding something? Lu Zhou was the first to speak. Yella followed up and asked, Could it be that they're going to make a big move and are using this as a cover? Not only did Yang Qindong ask this question, but the 2 of them also said this. After thinking about it, they also found something strange. For example, why would they send cavalry to challenge them at such a late hour? For example, they had lost all 3 battles during the day, but why would they want to carry out a 4th battle? Could it be that they had found a way to attack? Just as the 2 regimental commanders finished speaking, the curtain of the military tent was lifted and the captain of the 1st Guard team, Qiu Vi, walked in. As soon as he came to Yang Qindong's side, he stood at attention and said, Reporting to the 6th young master, the 100 Tatar cavalry that came to challenge us this time are the same as before. Also, you asked me to observe the other party's movements. The scout said that the other party is cooking and the camp looks very busy. That's right. After Yang Qindong heard this, he slapped his thigh and laughed. He felt that something was wrong before, so after Beta Persei went out, he called Qiu Vi and asked him to inquire about these 2 things. The answer to the first thing already proved that the other party didn't have any new methods. In other words, the so-called Tatar cavalry didn't have any new methods to attack. The second thing was to see if there were any changes in the Tatar camp. The conclusion now confirmed a lot of things. It was the end of July and the days were long and the nights were short. In order to prevent the soldiers from starving at night, meals were served late. Generally, when there was no war, meals wouldn't be served so early. Based on this alone, the Tatar camp's actions could be considered abnormal. What kind of person was Yang Qindong? With an extra lifetime of experience, the things he had seen and heard were far more powerful than the others. Especially his work in his previous life required him to be cautious. Many times, if the slightest problem was not discovered and solved in time, it would lead to irreparable consequences. So in terms of courage and carefulness, no one could compare to him. The sudden challenge from the Tatar cavalry made him vigilant, so it was not surprising. Of course, if He knew that he deliberately sent troops to challenge them in order to show that he was normal, but this kind of behavior was a bit excessive and would attract attention, he wouldn't know whether he should cry or cry. The enemy will definitely make a move. If my guess is correct, they are most likely preparing to retreat. Yang Qindong summarized the 2 pieces of information he just received. It was a bit arbitrary but also a bit resolute. The enemy is retreating. Hearing the news, Yila and Luzhua were startled, but they quickly nodded. As the saying goes, when things are abnormal there must be a demon. According to this kind of inference, the sixth young master's words were very reasonable. Since they guessed that the enemy was retreating, the two commanders immediately became spirited. Sixth young master, we should also immediately make preparations. Let's eat now and then keep an eye on them. Once we discover that they are retreating, we will chase after them and kill them. We will heavily injure or even wipe them out. Oh. To their surprise, Yang Qindong shook his head. Then he smiled and said, we will chase after them, but there is no need to eat. We can inform the soldiers to eat some cold food. In any case, the weather is hot right now, so it doesn't matter. The enemy doesn't want us to guess their intentions, so how can we not cooperate? By the way, Tiger's Mane and Windchaser should be rushing over with the army. Let's see where they are now. Yang Qindong's intention was to have a good rest at night and wait until tomorrow morning to launch an all-out counterattack. However, the plan was not as fast as changes. Since the enemy was already vigilant, the timing of the attack would naturally change. Young master, I will go and check. Beta Persei quickly nodded and walked out of the military tent. Yang Qindong was left behind to discuss the pursuit with the two commanders. After a while, Beta Persei walked back. Young master, I asked the scouts. They said that Tiger's Mane and Windchaser's Mane are rushing over to me. They should be able to meet us here in 1.5 hours. 1.5 hours. At that time the sky will be dark. I'm afraid they won't give us that much time. Yang Qindong said thoughtfully. Then he seemed to have thought of something. He suddenly got up and came to the sand table. He looked at it very seriously, then pointed to the west of Nanlin and said, send scouts to inform Tiger's Mane and Windchaser. Tell them not to come to us directly. Go to the place where the Tatar army retreated and set up an ambush. Tell them that time is limited and they must rush over as fast as possible. We will try to buy them some more time. Beta Persei accepted the order and left. Yang Qindong looked at Yila and Luzhua and said, you two will have to work hard. Immediately go down and have a mobilization meeting. Remember, don't gather together. Tell the officers below to hold the meeting in a row. In short, don't attract the enemy's attention. Chapter 7:16. Tatar Camp. The cavalry was eating. Su He, who had finished his meal first, walked out of the military tent. A scout came to him and reported in a low voice, General, there is nothing unusual on the side of the mercenaries. Su He replied calmly, and his heart was slightly relieved. This time they sacrificed another 100-man team to challenge the mercenaries. Presumably the other party should still be immersed in the joy of victory. They probably wouldn't have thought that they, who had just challenged the mercenaries, were now ready to retreat. Speaking of which, Su He still had another way to go. That was to go all out and fight the mercenaries to the death. It was just that in this way, even if they could win with the combat power of the mercenaries, they could only win with great difficulty. Without enough strength, even if they occupied the origin city, could they defend it? This was also a problem. In a big battle they paid a sufficient price, but did not get the corresponding benefits. This was definitely not what Su He wanted, let alone what Agador wanted. In desperation they had no choice but to retreat. Fortunately, no one would think that they would suddenly retreat when they had the advantage. In this way, once they gathered young Master Heruro's troops and General Gulang's troops, their strength was still not small. They could still attack and retreat freely. Didn't the Han people have a saying, where there is life, there is hope? As long as they had enough strength, they would not die out in the grassland. At worst, they could go and snatch other people's territories. With the strength of nearly 40,000 cavalry in their hands, how many people could be their opponent? It was a pity that the origin city was not fated to be with them. Thinking of this, Su He still felt a little regretful. In this way, pass down the order. After eating, have a good rest. When the sky is completely dark, we will retreat. Inform all the cavalry that no one can light the torches. Just leave quietly. Since they had decided to leave, there was obviously no need to think about other things. After Su He shook his head vigorously, he instructed the scout beside him. It had to be said that Su He was worthy of being a famous general. He was very careful when doing things. If the opponent this time was not Yang Qindong but someone else, perhaps he would have been deceived by him. The sky gradually darkened, to the point where they had to use torches to see the road under their feet. But from afar he could still see some shadows, so Su He wanted to wait a little longer. But at this moment an unexpected thing happened. Suddenly, a scout came to report that the mercenaries had sent a team of 100 cavalrymen to challenge them. They want to challenge me? It's already so late. Can you still see clearly? Su He was surprised and puzzled when he heard the news. The scout also had a confused look on his face. He was only responsible for passing on the message. Other things were not for him to consider or question. Alright, since they're here, then let's fight. How about this? Arrange a team of 100 to fight with them. But make sure to tell them that if they can't win, then retreat. There's nothing to be ashamed of. This is also my order. Su He did not want to agree, but if he did not agree, what would he do if the other side was alerted? In the end, he had no choice but to accept the challenge. What Su He didn't know was that this was just Yang Chendong's stalling tactic. He was giving Su He a taste of his own medicine. Right now he needed time to give Tiger Edge, Windchaser and the others some time. After thinking about it, sending someone to challenge them now was the best option. If it was a normal day, the Tatar tribe might not agree if they sent people to challenge them at this time. But now they wanted to escape. As the saying goes, a thief has a guilty conscience. They would definitely accept the challenge. With this in mind, a company of cavalrymen was sent out. So he did not think too much about it. In his opinion, the other side clearly wanted to continue showing off their strength. Moreover, he had issued 4 challenges during the day. Wouldn't he allow them to challenge him again? This was a very normal thing. Just like this, when night fell, both sides sent a team of 100 to fight on the prairie. The result was needless to say. Of course, the Tatar cavalrymen were defeated. Compared to the day, this battle was shorter. But even so, the mercenaries were able to gain half an hour of time. This was because even after the battle ended, the victorious mercenaries didn't retreat immediately. Instead, they stood on the spot and cursed for a while. After cursing to their heart's content, they laughed heartily and said that they were going back for dinner and returned happily. The scout came back with news that there were fireworks in the mercenary camp. This made Su He feel relieved. Since the other side chose to cook it this time, they must not have thought that he would escape. The opportunity finally came. Pass down the order. The army will retreat in order. Leave the torches and tents behind. In order to completely cover up the traces of the retreat, Su He made a lot of sacrifices. When the sky was completely dark, the Tatar cavalrymen finally began to retreat. Agar Dorj was in the army and he retreated with the first army. He left the dangerous task of covering the retreat to General Su He. Under the cover of the night, the scouts who were lurking within a mile of the Tatar camp saw everything with the help of night vision devices. Seeing that everything was as the 6th young master said, and that the enemy was really retreating overnight, the scouts secretly admired him and immediately sent someone to report the news. The mercenaries who did not hold torches had already mounted their horses. Their swords were sheathed and their bows were on their bodies. The news from the scouts confirmed the 6th young master's guess. There would be a big battle soon and it would be a chase. All the soldiers were somewhat excited. Yang Chendong was also riding on the white dragon horse. After hearing the exact news from the scout, his expression was also filled with excitement, and he shouted a good word. The enemy had decided to retreat, and now was the time to beat a drowning dog. Yang Chendong pulled out the saber at his waist and loudly said to the 5,000 cavalrymen beside him, "Soldiers, it's time to perform a meritorious service. Pass down my order, pursue and beat the Tatar cavalrymen. Beat the Tatar cavalrymen." The roar was like a tsunami, followed by the movement of thousands of horses. The torches were lit again and held in their hands. Other than a small number of soldiers who stayed behind to guard the camp, the rest of the cavalry let out a loud roar and all of them patted their horses and madly galloped toward the Tatar camp. The Tatar cavalrymen who were retreating step by step according to the plan suddenly saw countless torches coming from the front. The torches were getting closer and closer and they panicked for a moment. General Su He, who was commanding the army, was also shocked by the scene in front of him. His first thought was that his plan had been exposed and the enemy knew about it. Things are not good. You follow me. The rest of you quickly retreat. I will catch up with you later. As expected of Agar Dorji's #1 general, Su He quickly calmed down and quickly gathered the 3,000 cavalrymen to stay behind to cover the retreat. The situation was too sudden and it was useless to say anything. At this time they needed time to retreat. Suhi stepped forward bravely, holding the bow and arrow he often used, and shouted to the 3,000 cavalrymen behind him, "Follow me and use the bow and arrow to counterattack and suppress the enemy's momentum." 3,000 cavalrymen and 3,000 arrows. Under the simultaneous attack, the battle formation was very shocking. At least in Suhi's opinion, it would not be a problem to hold on for a while. The rest of the Tatar army quickly retreated. Suhi led the 3,000 cavalrymen and waited for the mercenaries to come closer. When the first torches were less than 200 meters away, Suhi took the initiative to draw his bow and shouted, "Everyone follow me and counterattack with the bow and arrow. Fire!" Suddenly, arrows were shot out like rain, heading straight for the mercenaries coming from afar. Wherever they shot there were torches. This seemed to have become a target marker, allowing everyone to find the direction of their attacks in the dark. Ding ding dang dang. The arrows fell like a dense rain, and from time to time, the torches would suddenly stop and fall to the ground. Under such a dense counterattack of arrows, many of the mercenaries were shot down from their horses. However, there were still more cavalrymen who rushed over. The ones in the lead were the black-armored cavalrymen, who were led by Yang Chendong and more than 100 guards. Taking the lead on the battlefield not only gave a strong motivation to the soldiers below, but also improved their morale. On the battlefield, the actions of a general could indeed lead the army to have a more positive effect. Relying on the protection of his heavy armor, he ignored the enemy's arrows and allowed them to land on his body, creating clanking sounds. Soon he closed the distance of 200 meters. Then he brandished his saber and killed the Tatar cavalrymen on their horses. Turn around, retreat while fighting. Suhi, who already knew the strength of the mercenary cavalry, knew that if he directly went up to fight with them, it would be difficult for the 3,000 cavalrymen, including himself, to escape alive. The only thing he could do now was to retreat while fighting. Only then could he see more chances of survival. Suhi kept retreating, and the 3,000 Tatar cavalrymen also fought and retreated with him. However, the drawbacks of doing this were also very big. If they didn't form a sufficient defensive line, they wouldn't be able to resist the attack of the mercenaries. In such a retreat, the losses of the Tatar cavalrymen were naturally great. After a few exchanges, about 500 cavalrymen's corpses were left behind. Retreat quickly, use the arrows to counterattack while retreating. Knowing that if this continued, the 3,000 cavalrymen would be eaten sooner or later, Suhi anxiously shouted. The Tatar cavalrymen were very obedient, or it could be said that they were very disciplined on the battlefield. After hearing Suhi's words, they turned around and fled. While fleeing, they used the arrows from time to counterattack. In this way, the original cavalry charge evolved into a chase. At this moment, the archers on both sides displayed their ability to fight on horseback. Arrows flew back and forth, and it was very lively. Chapter 7:17. However, even if it was a clash of bows and arrows, there was still the matter of who was the main attacker and who was the auxiliary attacker. As the chase continued, it was clear that the mercenaries who were charging in from the front had an advantage. The Tatar cavalry who were constantly retreating had suffered losses, and the number of cavalry had been sharply decreasing. Fortunately, the sky was completely dark at this time. If it was daytime, the losses would be even greater. However, the night also had its disadvantages. As they continuously retreated, the formation of the Tatar cavalry was already extremely chaotic. Some of the cavalry had run off to who knows where, making it impossible for them to form an effective defensive formation. They were unable to form a dense net like the mercenaries once they launched an arrow attack. As they kept retreating and the formation was in chaos, the Tatar cavalry's counterattack with bows and arrows no longer had the ability to deter them. They could only passively take a beating. In the end, even General Suhi himself separated from the main force with only a dozen soldiers. He still wanted to gather the scattered soldiers, but he didn't know where to find them. He sighed inwardly at his brother's good luck and could only lead the dozen or so personal guards to chase in the direction of the main force. The 3,000 Tatar cavalry were defeated just like that. Apart from the initial threat of the arrows, they didn't put up any decent resistance. From start to finish, they only delayed Yang Chendong's troops for a little more than 2 hours. The main force of the mercenaries once again entered the process of chasing the enemy. During this time, the main force of the Tatar cavalry didn't run very far. This was because not long after they escaped from the southern forest under the leadership of Lord Agar Dorje, they encountered the Tiger's Man Independent Regiment and the Windchaser Regiment that were responsible for ambushing and blocking. The two regiments were ordered to guard the retreat of the Tatar cavalry. Just as they began to set up the battlefield and ambush, they saw many figures in the distance. The main force of the Tatar cavalry was rushing over. Attack! Tiger's Man didn't even have time to dig up the mines. He led his 3 gun brigades to launch a frontal assault on the retreating Tatar cavalry. The sudden gunshots, the dense gunshots without any warning, and the whistling of the flames that could be seen in the darkness, instantly disrupted the formation of the retreating Tatar cavalry. After a series of gunshots, at least a few hundred riders died on their horses, and over 1,000 were injured to varying degrees. Seeing the firearm battalion of the mercenaries here, Agar Dorje, who was following the army, naturally turned pale with fright. What he was more worried about wasn't how much of an attack he had suffered. He was more worried about why there were so many mercenaries here. Shouldn't they have been pinned down by General Glenn's headquarters on the northern slope of the West River? Could it be that their appearance here meant that something had already happened on both sides? As soon as this thought appeared in his mind, Agar Dorje felt uneasy. When the Kiliarchs came to ask for instructions, he actually didn't have a definite idea. Speaking of which, Agar Dorje's military talent wasn't very good. It was only because he was born into a good family and had followed his elder brother Tuachuo since he was young that he gradually began to master the military. When it came to controlling people's hearts, he might have some methods, but when it came to commanding on the battlefield, his ability was far inferior. In his confusion, Agar Dorje, who didn't have much military talent to begin with, didn't have any better ideas. Faced with the instructions of his junior generals, he could only order the army to charge through the enemy's defensive line. Only in this way could they have a chance to escape. Without a strict organization, the Tatar cavalry charged in 1,000-men formation. However, facing Tiger's Man's 3 gun brigades, 7 cavalry brigades, and more than 2,000 cavalry from the Windchaser group, such a charge naturally caused heavy losses. The battle lasted for more than 2 hours. Apart from about 3,000 cavalry that managed to break through the encirclement, the rest of the Tatar cavalry were still trapped here, unable to escape. It was at this time that General Zhou Xian rushed over with 12 soldiers. Agar Dorje, who was at his wits' end, was overjoyed when he heard the news and wanted to hand over the command of the army to him. However, when the two met, General Zhou Xi's head was already covered in cold sweat. The first sentence he said made Agar Dorje feel as if the heavens wanted to kill him. "Sir, behind me is the main force of the mercenaries. This time, with 2 sides surrounding us, I'm afraid that the army won't be able to escape destruction. So fast." Hearing that the main force of the mercenaries was coming from behind, Agar Dorje felt as if the world was spinning and he couldn't see any hope. In contrast, Zhou Xian was much calmer. Although the current situation was very difficult, it wasn't that they didn't have any advantages. For example, their current total military strength was higher than the enemy's. For example, it was now night and they were better at escaping. Of course, even if they had more military strength than the enemy, Zhou Xian wasn't arrogant enough to think that they could achieve a full counterattack and achieve victory. The continuous escape had caused the army to lose the most important morale. To put it more harshly, the morale of the army might collapse at any time. Once that happened, there was no doubt that they would lose. Although Agar Dorje had many faults such as being greedy, cowardly, bullying the weak and fearing the strong, in any case this person was still his superior. If Agar didn't put him in an important position, he wouldn't be where he was today. At this moment, Zhou Xian made up his mind to repay Agar Dorje. "Your Excellency, it is impossible to turn the tables now. You can only escape and hope that you can rise again to take revenge for what happened today." Zhou Xian said as if she had made some kind of decision. When he made this decision, he was also prepared to sacrifice himself at any time. Agar Dorje was shocked by Zhou Xi's decision. He was a little touched and asked, "If I leave, what about you, General?" "Me? Of course I'll stay and lead the army to fight the mercenaries. If I don't do that, I'm afraid that you won't be able to take the opportunity to escape." Zhou Xian smiled bitterly. Who didn't want to live? But when he was destined to sacrifice others, he could only choose to stay. After all, the other party was Agar Dorji and he was only a general under him. Agar Dorji of course knew this truth. At this moment he was extremely excited and angry. He was excited because Suhi was willing to sacrifice him to protect himself. He was angry because this battle had cost them everything. From now on he could no longer be a powerful force on the prairie. The glory of the past had nothing to do with him. Regardless of what he thought, Agar Dorji finally agreed to Suhi's request and chose to leave. At this time he really handed over the command of the army to Suhi. He only left 3,000 elite cavalrymen with him to break out of the encirclement. After Suhi got the command, the first thing she did was to let the soldiers around her spread the news that General Gulang of the North Slope and Hala Ruo of the West River were coming here. As long as they could hold on until dawn, the army would come to support them and turn the tide. Of course, this was impossible. According to Suhi's judgment, it was very likely that the two armies had met with mishap. Otherwise, where would the mercenaries find the strength to intercept him here? But he still had to tell the public this. Only then would the morale of the army not be in chaos and not collapse, creating a chance for Agar Dorji to escape. Sure enough, Suhi's strategy was correct. After the news was released, the originally chaotic Tatar cavalry calmed down a lot. People were afraid of having no hope. As long as there was hope, anyone would think of a way to fight for it. The morale of the army was temporarily stabilized. Suhi commanded the army to form a defensive line to block the attacks of the mercenaries behind him. At the same time he sent 2,000 cavalrymen to charge at the mercenaries blocking the road. He wanted to tear a hole in the front in the shortest time possible to create a chance for Agar Dorji to escape. With the morale of the army stabilized, the orders were carried out seriously by the cavalrymen below. When Yang Qindong brought the main army to the rear of the Tatar cavalry, it was not as easy as expected. Instead it was met with strong resistance. What's going on? Yang Qindong saw that many of the mercenaries were too careless and rushed too quickly. As soon as they entered the defensive line of the Tatar cavalry, they were submerged. In a short period of time they lost hundreds of cavalrymen. He ordered his men to stop the attack and called over the scouts to ask about the situation. The battalion commander of the reconnaissance battalion, Su Yunxing, had already joined the army at this moment. When he was called over by Yang Qindong for questioning, he told him what he saw. Sixth young master, the Tatar cavalry was indeed in chaos before, but because of the arrival of Suhi the situation changed. I don't know why they stabilized the morale of the army and had the power to fight back. After all, the time it happened was too short. It was already very difficult for the reconnaissance battalion to obtain this information. Yang Qindong did not mean to blame the other party. Instead he asked with interest, after Suhi came back, the morale of the army stabilized? Seems that this person has some ability. Yes, we learned from some of the prisoners that the order to retreat was also given by this person. Seems that his insight on the battlefield is also good. Beta Persei added. Haha, then I am interested in this person. Yang Qindong laughed. Now was the time to use people. If the other party was really capable, then he did not mind recruiting him for his own use. It was just that the enemy had not been defeated yet. It was a bit too early to think about this. Like this, give the order. Don't rush to attack. When the army arrives, launch a fierce attack in units of battalions and companies. We need to advance in all directions. We can't do any individual breakthroughs. Also, the reconnaissance battalion must immediately figure out the situation and allow you to see the prisoners freely. Yang Qindong was not willing to fight a battle that he was not confident in. At least he would not rashly launch a fierce attack before he figured out what was going on in the enemy camp. Chapter 7:18. Beta Persei and Su Yunxing went to carry out the order. Soon the mercenaries' attack changed from the previous random attacks to an organized advance. As a result, the Tatar cavalry fell into a situation where they were forced to retreat step by step. It was beyond Suhi's expectation that the mercenaries behind him reacted so quickly. He guessed that there might be a general in the enemy's camp who knew more about tactics and was commanding them. But now he was not concerned about this. He was more concerned about whether the 2,000 cavalrymen he sent would be able to open a bloody path for Lord Agar Dorji to escape. Under the command of death, the 2,000 Tatar cavalrymen launched a suicidal attack. They were not afraid of the bullets and mercenaries who were several times their number. They just lowered their heads and charged forward. This kind of desperate fighting style finally allowed them to tear open a hole, giving Lord Agar Dorji an escape route. The 3,000 Tatar cavalrymen who were also carrying hope left the group. In addition to the ones who fled before, there were already 6,000 to 7,000 Tatar cavalrymen who rushed out. The Tatar cavalry paid a price. Of the 2,000 cavalrymen sent out, apart from those who died in battle or were captured, none of them returned to the barracks. Phew! Suhi breathed a long sigh of relief. Her heart, which had been hanging high before, was relieved. Now that Agar Dorji had escaped, his only worry was gone. The next step was to fight a bloody battle with the mercenaries. He would use his death to prove that the Tatar cavalry was not to be trifled with. At this time, nearly 2 hours had passed since Yang Chendong summoned Su Yunxing. In an hour the sky would be bright. At this time, Battalion Commander Su finally learned from the captives that He was able to unify the troops and quickly reported it to the 6th Young Master. Oh, this He actually came up with such an idea. He really has some ability. After listening to Su Yunxing's story, Yang Chendong couldn't help but sigh. This He was really a capable person. Previously he didn't know how the other party did it, so he could only win step by step. But now that he knew the method the other party used, he only needed to find a way to counter it. How about this? Pass down my orders. Everyone stop attacking and wait for daybreak. Once the enemy attacks, the musketeers will be at the front and the archers will be at the back, suppressing them from breaking through. This was not the result that Yang Chendong wanted to see. Since that was the case, he would just surround them and not attack. What he wanted now was not to destroy them but to conquer them. The mercenaries suddenly stopped their fierce attacks and the front line became quiet. This scene caught Su He, who was in the midst of the final battle, off guard. When he heard that there were no more sounds of killing coming from outside, he didn't know why, but he had a bad feeling. General, could it be that they are preparing for a big attack? Some Kiliarchs who were also confused came to Su He and asked for instructions. Someone asked, "General, it's almost dawn. When will our reinforcements arrive?" That's right. The soldiers below are looking forward to it. After a night of fighting, everyone is tired and suffered heavy losses. The soldiers below are very nervous. Su He obviously couldn't say that there were no reinforcements at all. Otherwise, the army would lose their morale and be unable to fight. In order to stabilize the situation, he could only continue to make arrangements. It's not far from dawn. The reinforcements should be here soon. What we need to do now is to accumulate strength. Once the reinforcements arrive, we will attack from the inside and outside and completely defeat the mercenaries. Hearing Su He's certainty, the Kiliarchs below couldn't help but smile with joy. They immediately agreed that they would do their best to stabilize the morale of the army before leaving. Su He, who was left behind, was puzzled. Could it be that the mercenaries were really preparing to launch a big attack? If that was the case, he had already decided to lead the army to fight to the death. When the time came, even if he died in battle, he would be able to deal a huge blow to the mercenaries. He wouldn't have lived in vain. But what if the other party wasn't going to attack? What if they had other plans? What should he do then? He looked up at the sky, although it was still so dark. However, Su He knew that the sky would brighten in 2 hours. In other words, there wasn't much time left for him to fight. Su He knew that he was going to die. He wanted to fight a bloody battle with the mercenaries and die on the battlefield with the dignity of a soldier. Unfortunately, the mercenaries didn't act according to his plan. They suddenly stopped attacking and just surrounded him from afar. This gave Su He a bad feeling in his heart. As the saying goes, what you are afraid of will come true. Just when Su He was wondering if the other party had figured out her plan, suddenly there was a shout from the front line. The voice that only belonged to the Han people came clearly at this moment. "Brothers of the Tatar cavalry, you have been fooled. You won't have any reinforcements at all. No matter Hala Ruochu of the Shiha Regiment or Jalong of the North Slope Regiment, they have been defeated by our mercenaries. We even captured Hala Ruochu alive. Now you are all alone. Surrender immediately. Otherwise you will only die and it won't be worth it. Tatar cavalry brothers, you have been fooled. We won't have any reinforcements no matter." The shout came one after another. It was transmitted to the Tatar army through the simple loudspeakers. When the cavalrymen heard the news for the first time, they all looked at each other with ugly and angry expressions. Their faces were ugly because of the situation they were in. They were angry because they knew that they were fooled. For a moment the camp was like a nest that exploded. No matter how hard the Kiliarchs tried, they couldn't suppress it anymore. Left with no choice, these Kiliarchs could only band together and come to Zhou Xian to ask for an explanation. Zhou Xian didn't panic like everyone thought. Instead he rode on his horse calmly. Looking at the angry Kiliarchs, he lowered his head and admitted his mistake. "I'm sorry everyone. I lied before. We might really have no reinforcements." "What? Really no reinforcements? If that's the case, what should we do next?" "Without reinforcements, we won't be a match for the mercenaries." "That's right. What should we do? General Zhou, please come up with a plan." The Kiliarchs all talked at once. Facing Zhou Xian, who admitted everything, they suddenly realized that they weren't that angry. After all, he didn't take the opportunity to escape. Instead he stayed here like everyone else. With this they couldn't vent their anger. First, Zhou Xian calmed the Kiliarchs down. Then he talked about how to deal with the mercenaries. "Brothers, it's obvious that the mercenaries want to use psychological tactics to win without a fight. If that's the case, we'll all become their prisoners. We'll even live a life worse than death. Since that's the case, why don't we give it a try? Maybe we'll have a chance to survive. Even if I can't escape and die on the battlefield, I can die a happy death and be a hero." "General, you mean?" The Kiliarchs had already guessed what Zhou Xian was going to do next. "I mean, let's give it a try and kill our way out. Let's leave it to fate." Zhou Xian also knew that at this moment he could only tell the truth. Only then would they have a chance to live. Breaking out of the encirclement wasn't an easy thing to do. Most people might even lose their lives here. But as Zhou Xian said, if they didn't do this, they didn't have any better choice now. These Kiliarchs looked at each other and finally nodded helplessly. After getting the support of these Kiliarchs, Zhou Xian immediately gave the order for the entire army to charge out under the cover of the moonlight. After the order was given, the Tatar cavalry, who were still doubting whether they were tricked, were speechless by General Zhou Xian's sincerity. Although they were angry, they didn't want to be captives. They didn't even dare to imagine what life would be like as captives. They could only try their best and hope that the heavens would take care of them and let them live. Every single one of them held on to the hope that they could survive. One by one they unsheathed their cavalry sabers. Taking advantage of the fact that the sky had yet to brighten, they charged out to kill. When the hundreds and thousands of Tatar cavalry charged out, their battle formation was quite large. The moment the earth shook, the Tiger's Man independent regiment guarding the outermost perimeter felt it. As the regiment commander, Tiger's Man immediately ordered the 3 battalions of musketeers to get ready. At the same time, he ordered the soldiers who were burying the mines to retreat and prepare for battle. Behind the independent regiment, the Windchaser division that reinforced the 1st Regiment of Cavalry also prepared their bows and arrows, ready to fire at any time when the enemy approached. More and more Tatar cavalrymen were charging towards them. They seemed to have understood their situation. If their first charge was fruitless, then it would be even more difficult for them to come up with a good result. This time the number of cavalrymen charging towards them increased, and their speed was also very fast. Although it was night, the earth was shaking, giving people the feeling that thousands of men and horses were bravely charging through a single plank bridge. Because of this, many of the mercenaries' expressions became very cold. Some of the soldiers even had cold sweat coming out of their palms. Sensing the nervousness of the soldiers, Tiger Edge, who had always been by Yang Qindong's side and had developed the aura of a general, laughed out loud. "Everyone, don't panic. We are well prepared. The enemy won't be able to rush over." As if to prove his words, a deafening explosion suddenly rang out. Streaks of fire soared into the sky and dyed the originally dark night. It actually lit up the eyes of the soldiers, allowing them to clearly see everything that was happening in front of them. Chapter 719. In the end, the Tatar cavalry still managed to rush into the landmines, triggering lightning and fire, sending countless enemy cavalry into the sky. After the landmines exploded, the fragments flew into the bodies of many Tatar cavalrymen, making them look like hedgehogs, screaming and wailing in pain. Under this kind of attack, the Tatar cavalry that rushed quickly became the target of the attack. Some of the cavalry at the front didn't even have time to shout before they were swallowed up by the ruthless power of the landmines. The powerful landmines caused the Tatar cavalry to involuntarily stop in their tracks. Their faces were pale as they looked forward. Their hearts were filled with complex feelings, but they were unable to speak. Fire! With the help of the monstrous flames, Tiger's man noticed that many Tatar cavalry had stopped 500 meters in front of them. He made a prompt decision and gave the order to fire. He knew that at this time if he gave the enemy a heavy blow, it would be the last straw. It would play an extremely important role in deterring the enemy. With a loud shout, the 3 battalions fired at the same time. Although in the darkness the accuracy of these auxiliary soldiers was greatly reduced, but the number of Tatar cavalry was large enough. Coupled with the fact that they weren't prepared at all, a burst of gunshots rang out. Who knew how many Tatar cavalry fell from their horses? First the landmines sent people into the sky, then the firearms easily took people's lives. Under this kind of pressure, the Tatar cavalry had no choice but to retreat one by one. Originally it seemed that the first attack with great momentum was fruitless. On the contrary, it was a big blow to their morale. After the failure of the assault, when most of the cavalry returned, many of them had a pessimistic expression on their faces. Many of them were already scared. In this kind of situation where they couldn't even see how many enemies there were and where they were, many of their brothers had died. This kind of fighting style really made them unable to see any hope of victory. After Suhi learned about the situation at the front line, he couldn't say a word for a long time. He knew that the situation might be worse than he imagined. If they couldn't rush out, then wouldn't it mean that they could only choose to surrender? The battlefield once again fell into silence. The mercenaries' voices came again. It was still the same words as before, but compared to before, this time some people began to be moved. The curses were also much less than before. The persuasion continued and the sky finally began to brighten. After their vision returned to normal, the Tatar cavalry only felt more despair. In this kind of situation where their every move was clearly seen by the enemy, it would naturally be much more difficult for them to escape. At dawn, the persuasion continued, but the mercenaries didn't take a step forward. They also didn't rely on the advantage of the firearms in their hands to attack. Instead they began to cook. Smoke spirals, and not long after, the aroma of meat. Young master, our logistics camp's chefs are all here. They are still using the condiments produced in Crimson City. Along with the freshly slaughtered meat, it will definitely be fragrant. Yang Er walked in front of Yang Chendong as if he was presenting a treasure, looking for praise. Very good. Yang Chendong nodded with satisfaction. While looking at the Tatar cavalry camp, he said, "Food is the most important thing to the people. The temptation of food can often achieve the goal of invincibility." Yang Chendong's guess was right. Using food to lure the enemy had proven to be very useful. In the past, the mercenaries had often used this trick to destroy the enemy's morale. This time it was also successful. Yesterday afternoon, before the sky turned dark, they had eaten dinner. Now it had been nearly 12 hours. During their escape, because the mercenaries were chasing closely behind them, some of the pots and bowls of food they brought along were thrown away halfway. They thought that they could kill their way out before dawn, so no one was worried about this matter. But now, after dawn, many of the cavalry's stomachs began to growl. Although many of them had a certain amount of dry food on them, it was absolutely not a problem for them to survive for at least 2 or 3 days. But the problem was that that was cold food. How could it be compared to hot food that was overflowing with the aroma of meat? After using the MSG and other things produced by Chichen City, the taste was particularly delicious. Saying that the aroma would spread for 10 miles might be an exaggeration, but with the morning breeze, it would not be a problem for it to spread for 2 to 3 miles on the open ground. When the aroma spread to the Tatar cavalry camp, many of the cavalry's expressions became somewhat abnormal. Especially those who were preparing to take out their dry food, their expressions became even more unsightly. Comparing people to people would lead to death, and comparing goods would lead to throwing away. Compared to the aroma of the fresh meat, the cold dry food was too tasteless. At this time, the voice urging them to surrender sounded again. Among them there were some words about food. For example, the mercenaries promised that as long as they surrendered, they would immediately be able to eat fresh meat. At that time they would be able to eat hot flatbread and drink meat soup. It would definitely be a delicacy. The picture outlined made many of the cavalry unable to help but make a swallowing motion. Then the soldiers looked at each other as if they were somewhat tempted. Hello everyone, my name is Hulu, an authentic Mongolian. In a battle I became a captive of the mercenaries. I originally thought that my life would be worse than death. But who would have thought that not only would I be able to live a better life and receive more money every month, I would also become a commander of 1,000 soldiers. The reason why I am telling you all this is to tell you that the reason why we gave up our homes and fought with our blood and flesh is because we want to live a better life. Right now the opportunity is in front of you. As long as everyone surrenders to the mercenaries like me, as long as you have the ability, you do not have to worry about not being valued. This is the most realistic experience of a surrendered commander of 1,000 soldiers. Hello everyone, my name is Taimu a Nuzan cavalry. It was also in a battle that I became a captive of the mercenaries. Similarly, I am now a commander of a battalion. Now I can save up a lot of money every month. Not only is my food better than before, my clothes are also better than before. Once this war is over, I can find a beautiful girl from the grassland and start a family. Then I will have a bunch of children and live a life where I will not have to worry about food and drink. Hello everyone, my name is Lu Dai and I am also a Nuzan. I am also a captive. Previously, I was a deputy Qianhu in Baiming's newer Gandusi region. Now that I am a deputy commander, my treatment is more than 10 times better than before. Come quickly, there is delicious food that can strengthen our bodies. There are even sharper and more durable cavalry swords. There are also more high positions waiting for you. As long as everyone is willing to work hard, your future is limitless. Hello everyone, my name is Yila, and I was originally a Qianhu in Baiming's new Gandusi region. Now I am a commander of the Nuzan cavalry. After coming to the mercenaries, the most authentic experience I have had is that they have the best military treatment in the world. They have the strongest weapons in the world. They also have the most generous rewards in the world. As long as you are here, as long as you can mount a horse and kill the enemy, as long as you are sincere enough, this place will become the paradise you have always dreamed of. Come, we welcome you. One by one, the officers stepped forward to share their experiences. They expressed their views on the mercenaries and their own experiences from different perspectives. They did not speak of any great principles, but the more simple their words were, the more they could gain the approval of the ordinary cavalry. They could resonate with them. As the voices of these officers reached the Tatar camp, the expressions of many of the cavalry changed. They were eager to move. It was as if they were only missing an opportunity to stand up and choose to surrender. The Kiliarchs who were in charge of them naturally felt this change. They all anxiously went to General Su He, hoping that he could think of a solution that would satisfy both sides. However, Su He did not say anything. He only looked at the sky helplessly and shook his head. Everyone had the right to choose their own way of life and their own future. He could not interfere. In fact, he could not interfere either. Otherwise, if he forcefully suppressed them, it would cause a mutiny. On the contrary, if these soldiers could have a good way out, he would be happy. Forget it. Since that is the case, let's send some of the injured soldiers to them first. It is also good to see if these mercenaries are true to their words. If they are, you can choose to surrender in order to live a better life. If not, then we'll fight them to the death. At worst, we'll just die. Hearing Su He's words, all the Kiliarchs were speechless. However, they could not refute it. Could they say that the general was wrong? Could it be that it was wrong for a general to find a way out for his soldiers? No one objected and they could not object. After the order was passed down, some of the wounded Tatar cavalry became the first batch of captives to be sent to the mercenaries. Then everyone watched helplessly as the mercenaries dispatched a lot of troops. They used a stretcher to carry the Tatar cavalry away from the battlefield. At this moment, some people were envious of the injured soldiers. It seemed that only the wounded could openly defect to the enemy without being blamed by anyone. There were still calls to surrender from time to time, but as time passed, no one knew if the Tatar cavalry had become numb or if there were orders from above. In short, no one saw any uninjured cavalry choose to surrender. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.